Hello guys, this is your friend and we are back with a new fanfic story part 2. The fanfic title is What If Naruto Was Reborn as Hashirama's grandson and Became Konoha's Ultimate Prodigy part 2. If you like this fanfic, don't forget to subscribe my channel. Now let's start the fanfics. When he saw Shori stop to scrawl down that seal, he'd known that there was nothing good that would come of it. At least, they were done with the exam. He was proven right when the next team to approach the final tunnel stepped over the seal. It was only Shikahime's observant nature that allowed her to notice the glow on the floor before the seal went off. She activated her shadow jutsu and somehow used it to toss both her teammates out of the tunnel while she sank into the ground. She surfaced outside the tunnel a few seconds later, but no one had any attention to give her. All the attention was on the destroyed exit. Shori's seal had caused the tunnel to implode in on itself, so everyone within the mail was essentially sealed within by the stone that made up the path. Rather, all the attention flickered between the exit and Shori's brightly smiling face. He wanted to shrink in on itself as the screen magnified their own feed. His skin looked pasty white on the large display. It was clear that he wanted to be anywhere but here. Uzume glowered right at the receptor. Her glare shot from the screen in a way that showed her clear disdain for everyone watching. Shori, on the other hand, smiled and waved. He was smiling. A bright smile that made it clear he wasn't concerned with the shouts of him being a cheater that came from certain parts of the crowd. Toshiro was beginning to fear that the field would be overrun by pissed off spectators when the commentator's voice rang out. A brilliant tactic from the Konoha team. Sealing up the entrance to prevent others from making their way through easily, the samurai said with an approving hum, making it clear that nothing Shori had done was against the rules. Even better, he used Fuinjutsu, which was never mentioned in the rules, and waited until he was more than done with the exam before allowing his trap to take effect. A brilliant tactic, indeed. But let us not hesitate to give it up for the second team to pass this stage, Team 66 from Konoha, Yamanaka Inoken, Nara Shikahime, and Akamichi Choni. Jiraiya's words put paid to the whispers as everyone moved to applauding Shikahime's team. Even better, the screen decided to show a replay of them escaping the trap. XXXXX. At the end of the day, it took an hour for someone to finally complete the maze again. It was the team they'd passed from Iwa. They made it to the sealed exit, like multiple other teams had. But instead of taking it as a dead end like the other teams had, the muscular one moved forward to examine the site of the cave-in. He exchanged words with his teammates, and then they walked backwards before the one with red hair made a single hand seal the tiger seal. Instead of a fireball, he breathed out multiple small balls of lava. They slammed into the cave-in and shot through. The blockage on the exit was lifted, and they walked through. The fourth team to pass was Izuku's. Only the fourth by a technicality because it seems they had run into Uraum's team at some point in the maze and then chosen to work together to complete the rest of it. Uraum stepped backwards to allow Izuku step through first. Toshiro noted that all four of the genin teams to have graduated with him had been in the top 5. The next team had the boy with bi-colored hair that Shori had been staring at for a while. He noticed him watching their feet even before they got to the exit. Subsequently, teams started to pass through at a steady rate. All in all, the first stage had taken close to 3 hours from start to end. Shori's prank had definitely lengthened the task beyond all expectations. Now that we have our first 14 teams, we can end the task, Jiraiya's voice rang out before the max began to open up. Those still within it were visibly disappointed to find that they had lost and been disqualified. In one fell swoop, they'd gone from hundreds to 14 genin teams. I hope you all got your fill of the calmer task. From now, we'll be diving right into the action, Jiraiya said, and the ground began to vibrate again. All the genin who passed had been returned to the central platform, while everyone else was made to evacuate the field. Toshiro noted that apart from his genin class, one other team had passed from Konoha. One team each had passed from both Kumo and Iwa. 2 teams had passed from Suna. Shockingly, 3 teams had passed from Kiri. 1 team had passed from the Hidden Waterfall Village, and the last 2 teams had come from the Land of Hot Water, and the Land of Grass respectively. All 5 major villages were represented, but Konoha had the majority. He watched as the field shifted. Two hills began to rise from the surrounding earth with flags on them, one red and one green. For the second task, we have a new game to play. This one involving all 14 teams in plain view of you, the viewing audience. It's called King of the Flags. As you can see, there are two hills and two flags in the playfield. Your task is simple. Every team is to work on their own to complete one of two objectives, either take the hill or take the flag. Taking the hill means having the only people on the peak of the hill be members of one's team. For every 30 seconds that a team holds the hill, they get 20 points. If the hill is in contention, meaning that the people on the hill are members of more than one team, then the points are shared between the teams equally. As for the flags, the rule involving the flags is simple. Taking the flag means having possession of the flag at the end of the stage. Each flag is worth 200 points. The top 5 teams at the end will move on to the final stage of this exhibition. He said, going on a long spell that I tried my best to keep track of. It reminded me of 2 games from my past, and it also told me that grandmother Mito had more of a role in designing these than she let on. I'd told her about King of the Hill and Capture the Flag before. In fact, it was a game she enjoyed playing with me with figurines. Of course, we had these cool puppets powered by Fuinjutsu that could move in all sorts of ways. I guess designing this test like this was supposed to give me some sort of advantage. Just to clarify, the flags are not to be removed from their poles, and they must not be hidden at all during the task. Does everyone understand the rules? He didn't wait for an answer. Good. You have 3 minutes to strategize among yourselves. Jiraiya finally said, and shut off the feed from his mic. The crowd's buzzing nod at me as they chattered about the undoubtedly exciting task to themselves. I turned to both Uzume and Toshiro and began to make signs at them. Focus on the flags, I asked first. Negative. That's what most of them will be thinking as well. Having to keep it openly displayed means we'd sooner end up in a situation like whoever gets the hill, without the benefit of the high ground, Uzume replied, signing furiously. I thought over her words and nodded. It provided one advantage over the hill, mobility. But at the end of the day, we'd have to fight off everyone who wasn't going to scrap over the hills. I tried to come up with a plan, but literally the only other option was scrapping it for the top of the hill. I knew that was the option Uzume preferred. Both because she was that type of person, and she literally just signed it at us. We'd have to fight at least half the people here by ourselves. And we have to make sure they don't stay on the hill in any large numbers because splitting those points would be terrible. I signed back. She wanted to sign something back before Toshiro stepped between us. Uzume was no longer antagonistic with me, not as much as she used to be, but we were still far from friends. Teammates maybe, but not friends. I have an idea, his fingers said for him. How long will it take you to make a barrier that rejects outsiders? How long can you keep it up for? Both questions were addressed to me. Since I already know the script for an excellent one, it'll probably take about 3 minutes with clones. And as for keeping it up, I can go for hours if it isn't being assaulted. Under heavy assault, maybe 30 minutes, but I'd be dead on my feet afterwards. I said to him. Being a quarter Senju and a quarter Uzumaki meant I had chakra reserves that put some Junin to shame. I wasn't Naruto, by any means. At about 6 shadow clones, I was tapped out. But I wasn't lacking when it came to reserves. Good. My idea is this. Uzume and I buy you the time to make the barrier, and once you can get it up, we chill at the top of the hill. He signed. It was a good idea, I thought. Better than whatever I had. I signed that to both of them, and Uzume signed her willingness soon after. She'd get to fight to her heart's content, so it probably soothed the battle lust in her Uchiha blood. I slapped myself at that thought. I was slipping up more and more. The more time I spent in the clan compound, reading scrolls from previous clan heads, and talking to granduncle, the more anti-Uchiha propaganda was shoved down my throat. It was a subtle and insidious thing. Like how Senju Benimaru, the 17th clan head, had written that Uchiha had a natural lust for battle, ignoring that we Senju enjoyed fighting just as much as they did. We started half the conflict between our clans, after all. He even ignored Senju Kenpachi, who loved to fight so much that he came close to ending the entire Uchiha clan, but allowed the survivors to leave simply because he wanted them to get stronger and present him with a good fight. My thoughts were knocked out of my head, as someone walked towards us. Izuku. He had both his teammates behind him. I smiled at him, and he smiled back. I saw your plan. We want in, he said. He wasn't talking to me. He was talking to Toshiro. And my ever affable teammate turned to him with a sharp smile on his face. Fuck off, I choked. I actually choked on air and had to bend over. I missed the next part of the interaction. We could just as easily ruin the entire plan if we wanted to. Let us in. Besides, if you want to cover Mr. Seal Master over there, then the two of you won't be enough, he said. Hold on, how did you even know our plan? I cut in before Toshiro could reply. He flashed his Sharingan for a second, and I almost facepalmed. Of course. The point is, we want in. We have the numbers to help you make this thing work, he said, still talking to Toshiro. Fine. But you'll do precisely as I say. Sure thing, Captain, he said with a sincere smile on his face. Now that I'm in on this, I say you should probably stop assuming you're the only ones who speak Anbu code. I saw Yuraum peeking at you guys earlier with her eyes, and Shikahime's gaze hasn't left your team since you started your little strategizing session, he said. I wanted to sink into the floor, embarrassed at making such a rookie mistake. I'd defaulted to standard operations protocol for missions, not computing that we were surrounded by Konoha nin here. If anyone spoke the code in our year group, then Shikahime, Izuku, and Yuraum would be my first guesses outside of my team. Do you think they'll come for us? I asked him. Only a fool would try to fight both you and Uzume-chan working together. They'll probably work around you guys. But if they get the chance, I doubt they'd hesitate. I nodded at his words. Good. Now, let's complete the plan, he said, switching over to English. I smiled at the confused faces around us. Teaching the language to Izuku so we could plan pranks and pretending that I'd come up with it was reaping dividends even now. When he and Izuku HD completed the plan, he turned to his teammates and told them, just follow my lead when the buzzer rings. It's going to be a bit like Formation 7, but you'll notice the twist when it happens. Toshiro nodded with a shrug, but Hume looked between Izuku and me for a few tense seconds. Almost like she was deciding whether it would be a good idea to play ball or not. Finally, she signaled her capitulation with a slow nod. I gave her one back, thankful. I wasn't an idiot. This plan would be noticeably more difficult without her cooperating. She was easily one of the strongest genin here, after all. I turned to Izuku's team and watched him communicate with both Kizaru and Omoikane. Watching that reminded me that I hadn't seen much of the Kurama heir lately. Omoikane and I were more distant friends, so it was understandable that we didn't see as often, but Kizaru was one of my best. I walked forward, moving past Izuku once he was done and placed a hand on Kizaru's shoulder to catch his attention. He looked up at me, startled. I smiled to calm him down, but that didn't work as well as it should have. He still blushed in embarrassment and stepped backwards. How have you been, Kizaru? We missed you at the last gathering. I said to him, silently asking the question. I've been lovely, Shori. I had lessons with some clan elders that couldn't really be skipped. Maybe you'll get to see what I learned in the next stage, he said with a smile that I returned. Of course, our conversation was brought to a quick end by the sound of the buzzer. I turned to the screen and found that it was beginning a countdown. 7 seconds left. We'll catch up once this is over. I promise, I said, and turned to face the hill we'd chosen to die on. The one to the left, which had a higher proximity of foreign shinobi close to it, and crucially had neither of the two foreign teams that had caught my attention. Sharp, I muttered to myself as I prepared to jet off. The screen counted down to 1 and then there was the sound of a horn. I smiled as I disappeared in a body flicker that took me right to the base of the hill. I quickly began to climb, ignoring most of the obstacles, and noting their presence when both Uzume and Izuku appeared behind me in short order. I crested the top of the hill first. Uzume followed shortly after. Toshiro and Izuku mounted it at the same time. I turned in a swift movement and formed a seal. The next body to jump over was riddled with air bullets. The water clone splattered to the floor, and the Mizu genin with the rebreather jumped right up immediately afterwards, tossing a bunch of shuriken my way. I transitioned from the bird seal to the snake seal, and a mud wall caught the projectiles before they hit me. She was forced to end her attack as Uzume dove right at her and kicked her back towards the ground. She landed on the hill, and they began to engage in furious taijutsu. One of her teammates crested the hill next, but they found Izuku waiting for them with flashing red eyes. The next people to complete the journey were Kizaru and Omoikane. I nodded at them and got to work. First things first, I took my scroll of my back and unrolled it. Much like the scroll my grandfather had carried, this was a complicated sealing matrix that basically stored a bunch of shit. I tapped one of the seals, seemingly at random, and funneled my chakra into it. After a massive puff of chakra smoke, I found myself holding a massive sealing brush with an inker next to me. I smiled and dipped the brush into the ink and began to paint the ground with my seals. I was no stranger to barrier techniques. No one who had spent years under an Uzumaki sealing master could claim to be unfamiliar with barriers. I knew I was more conversant than most. I knew multiple barriers that would serve our purposes. I also knew a few that would be even easier to set up. I could always set up something like the 4 Violet Flames formation with a few shadow clones, but there was every chance I'd run out of chakra trying to keep such a powerful seal active throughout the task. Asuna Shinobi appeared in my blind spot with a blade thrust at my neck. I ignored the attack and watched them turn their blade on themselves and stab it into their own stomach. Uzume appeared soon after and kicked him down the hill. I nodded at Kizaru with a smile and sent my thanks to Uzume with a nod. The former smiled back, but the latter merely grunted. "Get that seal done. We're under a lot of pressure," she said before disappearing towards another Suna Genin. Part of my wanted to study the Suna wind release in action, but I couldn't spare the focus. This wasn't a seal I had mastered. I couldn't draw it with my eyes closed, so I very much had to remain focused on every brush stroke. Especially since I was drawing directly on the stone surface of the hilltop. When I completed the seal, I turned to the flag beside me and whistled to draw attention to myself. I picked up the flagpole, and holding it like a javelin, I tossed it right in the direction of the platform we'd come from. A few shinobi broke off to chase the flag, and both teams had an easier time shoving everyone off the hill. Once I was sure only our teams remained, I slammed my palm on the seal and poured my chakra into it. After that, I began to weave seals at a furious pace. Ram hare snake dragon rat ox tiger hare snake dragon rat ox tiger ox snake tiger hare horse dragon rat snake rat ox tiger hare snake. Barrier gate 5 seals technique. Castle closing 8 gates, I pronounced. 5 gates rose around us. That was stage 1. They then began to spread out red energy in the form of a barrier that linked all of them. "Well, that was a success," I said with a smile. And then my shadow bulged before a head rose out of it. A head that was quickly followed by a set of hands. If the head hadn't had a very recognizable pineapple hairstyle, then I would have smashed it into the ground. Shikahime rose out of my shadow with a smile on her face. "That was a superb plan," she said. I could tell Uzume wanted to either punch her in the face or roast her to death with a great fireball, so I stepped in to stand in front of my cousin. "What are you doing, Shikahime?" I asked her, voice stern. "What do you think? I noticed that plan of yours and decided I wanted in," she said. "This doesn't work with 3 teams, Shika. The split isn't profitable like that," I pointed out. She smiled. "Not necessarily. I just have to be in the top 5 teams to make it out of this mess. Choni and Anoken are outside this nifty barrier, working to get points for us any way they can. This is just insurance." "Well, your insurance seems to be ruining things for us," Izuku butted in. "Consider it revenge for my cute little cousin almost killing us at the end of the first task. I apologized for that already. I had no real way to know that you'd be the ones to make it first. And I had every confidence that anyone in our year group would have been able to escape that with ease," I said. "I'd played much worse pranks on the class as a whole during our time at the academy." "Well, I accepted your apology. This is just payback. We're even now," she said. I turned towards the scoreboard, noticing that our teams were nowhere near the top 5. Receiving 6.5 points every 30 seconds would add up to about 130 points for the 10-minute task, but that was assuming we had the whole 10 minutes. The seal had taken me 2 minutes and some change to put up. That meant we lost some points from that period as a result of having so many teams around. Calculating it, I figured we'd have about 110 points at the whole task if nothing changed. On the other hill, both the Kumo and Iowa teams were duking it out with a reckless abandon. The kind of abandon that spurred something in me. That hill's flag was currently in the possession of the Kumo team, but they were under consistent pressure from the Iowa team. None of the other teams were even choosing to contest that particular hill. Beyond those wasting their energy against my barrier, the rest were fighting over the other flag for those 200 points. It was a tense standoff as all 7 of us stared at each other in the barrier. After a minute, even the Mizu Nin had abandoned trying to break the barrier to try their hands at acquiring the flag. The fight between the Iowa and Kumo teams remained at a consistent hot point. Every eye was on the exchange. The free-for-all that had begun on the stage for the other flag was also another source of tension. From the way things looked, at least one Kusa genin had been killed. A Suna genin with some affinity with poisons had incapacitated a whole Kiri team, and the remaining Kiri team was teaming up to launch some devastating combo jutsu to wear down the Suna group. Choni and Anoken weren't easy to find, but I was sure they were waiting and biding their time to snatch that flag at the last moment. It was the kind of thing they'd do. I'd love to see how it would pan out though, since it was clear that Uraum's team was winning the free-for-all as it stood now. I'd always wondered what a Hyuga who took ninjutsu seriously would look like, and Uraum was showing me that. Her wind ninjutsu were punishing. Kuro was a whirlwind as he and Shiro swept through the approaching horde with devastating taijutsu. They never let themselves get bogged down for too long, and they used both the Beast-Man and Man-Beast transformations to great effect. The boy you were fighting could become a dog at any second and vice versa. They were almost single-handedly displaying the power of Konoha's rich Teki Genkei arsenal. Shiba was the one placed in charge of physically keeping hold of the flag, and he was doing that with ease. Whoever managed to make it past either of his teammates would find themselves swallowed in a storm of insects. Not just any insects, but bugs bred with a special taste for flesh. One Taki genin had forfeited after having his arm eating down to the bone as he tried to fight through Shiba's cloud. Everyone had given him a wide berth since then. Another minute passed, and I made up my mind. The barrier would consume way less chakra than predicted since no one was even bothering to attack it. I crossed my fingers, and a clone appeared in a puff of smoke. He sat down in Caesar to focus on maintaining and altering the barrier as I needed. I'm leaving, I told my teammates. They'd both clearly been doing the same calculations as me, so Toshiro nodded while Uzume stepped up to join me. If there was anyone who understood my battle lust, it would be her. If there was anyone who would support my actions, it would be her. The barrier shifted to make a small gap that I wasted no time passing through. I ignored Izuku and Kizaru as they joined Uzume and I in crossing the barrier. For this, it would be every team for themselves. I assume you know what we'll be hunting, I said, turning to her. Her smile was sharp. We jumped off the hill as one. Chaos is a ladder. It's also a cage in a shark-infested pond, and a million other things because that's how chaos works. The next 3 chapters are up on the Place of Pa Tron's same username is up here, so feel free to check it out if you want to support my journey, but don't stress if you can't. Everything will come up here in its own time. Our intrusion in the battle between the Kumo and Iowa teams started with a bang. A great fireball jutsu powered up with a great breakthrough crashed into the middle of the battlefield and both teams operated long before the jutsu landed. The shockwave did send one of the Kumo nin flying into the air, but he was caught in time by one of his fellows. The rest watched with suspicious eyes as the both of us landed between them. Uzume was to my back. I felt her glee at her position, faced by a group of Iowa shinobi. I stared at the Kumo team with a smile on my face. I clapped my hands and the earth vibrated for a second. They were wise enough to move out of the way of the spikes that rose out of the ground where they had been standing, but that had been part of my plan. It forced them to split up. No longer a single unimpeachable front, I went for the willowy boy. He seemed the weakest of the bunch. He reacted to my approach in time, and put a hand on the blade at his waist and unsheathed it in a swift motion, Lado. It was the wrong reaction, however. Tsukumo wielded a blade as well, and did it with a variety of styles. I'd been in this situation 100 times before, and I knew just how to react. I ducked under the blade with a burst of speed and stepped into his space, removing the reach advantage the blade gave, and not giving him the time or space to bring his blade back around. My first attack was a shot on his lungs. 2 fingers with chakra shaped like a dagger stabbed into his body in 8 simple movements. By the time I was done, he collapsed to the floor, unconscious. I turned and flipped through 2 seals before breathing out a veritable wind storm. The wind chakra tore apart the lightning jutsu sent at me before I flipped through another set of seals. My 2 remaining adversaries were forced to dodge out of the way of my air bullets. I heard Uzume's laughter and found myself smiling against my will. A wide smile that refused to go down, no matter how much I tried to be serious in the face of the moment. Her joy was infectious. I weaved another set of seals, spitting out 2 mud balls to slow down my opponents as they ran at me. This time, I went after the one with the bicolored hair. Familiar or not, he'd be going down. He wielded his blade better than his teammate. His movements were sharper, and he was much smarter about it. Every step I took into his guard was matched by a similar step backwards. It was almost like a dance, until I was forced to duck to prevent his teammate from beheading me from behind. She'd finally dodged around the part of the battlefield marred with mud. Both of their blades suddenly flashed with lightning release, momentarily blinding me. In an instant, they executed the second part of the deadly combination, both blades sinking into my skin. Skin that browned before forming a hard mud that maintained a hold on their blades. I rose from the ground a fair bit away and smiled as I slammed my hands on the ground. Earth release. Swamp of the underworld, I screamed. Mr. Bicolor Hair had jumped out of the way from the moment he realized he wasn't able to remove his blade from the clone. His teammate wasted precious seconds trying to free her blade. It made all the difference as she was submerged all the way up to her neck in the dark mud. And then there was one. XXXXXXXX. One thing he had learned from having the prodigies of both clans on his team was that the Uchiha and Senju were not as different as they liked to pretend themselves to be. They were 2 sides of the same coin, for sure. Hashirama generally had a more personable energy than Uzume, but that did not take anything away from the similarities that existed between them. For one, their bloodlust. From the second, his Senju student had looked over at the fight between the Kumo and Iwa teams. He could tell the thoughts that ran in his mind. I want in on that. What separated Shori from Uzume was that Uzume would be much more direct with her thinking and honest with herself. She was eager to join the fight because they were strong. Hashirama would come up with a million reasons to explain why he was going to be doing what he would be doing. The end result was still the same. They left poor Toshiro to hold down the fort in that barrier of theirs and jumped right to join the fight. They'd probably get points taken off for that when it came to the secondary objective of these exams, but if he was being honest with himself, he was perfectly fine with that. They weren't ready to fly the nest. Not until they could actually work together. When they managed to engage their targets without getting in each other's way, he was ashamed to say he felt some pride at that. It was a sign of the progress that they'd managed to make in a year, but he could already see how their approach was flawed. Not even flawed because they failed to strategize properly. That would have been an entirely different beast to deal with, but it was flawed because they knew the right thing to do but never considered it because it would require them working together. Taking on organized teams each was stupid. A better approach would have been attacking all 6 at the same time as a group of 2. Separating them in such a way that some Iwa nin ended up with some Kumo nin, and then taking advantage of the chaos inherent in that. And that was only if they were too impatient to just let them fight it out between themselves and take the prize when they were exhausted. This plan of facing 2 composed teams at the same time was more risky. Not too risky, clearly. He internally amended his thoughts as he saw Shori begin combat with the Kumo team. It was a clear situation of him being a superior fighter to them, and also their teamwork being terrible. He'd probably have had a harder time if he had to fight them one by one. Tsukumo knew how much sense it made, however. Kumo only operated in 2-man teams. It was clear that they were being hampered by the introduction of a third teammate who did not fit in with the dynamic. He decided the battle was practically over as he watched the second teammate get taken down by Shori's jutsu, but that proved to be inaccurate. With a chirping sound, the girl caught in his swamp of the underworld jutsu erupted from the ground with a hand on her blade. She and the younger teenage with dual-colored hair faced down Shori, wary looks on their faces. On the other hand, Uzume was having a less fruitful timer against the Aiwa team. She was yet to be rebuffed as she dove from shinobi to shinobi. The one with red hair fought her off with smooth command over an interesting form of lava release. The other was one he'd been briefed on. Kitsuchi, the son of the Tsuchikage himself. He used earth release with almost as much skill as Shorirama but manifested differently. Where Shori used his talent to learn as many jutsu as possible and apply each of them in unique ways, Kitsuchi was more focused on learning a few jutsu and being able to apply them in unique ways. He could raise walls with stomps of his feet, and use those same cues to turn said walls into spikes that he sent flying at Tsukumo's student. Only Uzume's masterful use of the lightning flow with her gunbai allowed her to fight off his offensive. The third teammate kept running through seals and scowling as no effect appeared. Tsukumo's guess was that she was some sort of genjutsu specialist. The Sharingan and being on the same team as both Toshiro and Shorirama made it highly unlikely that there would be a genin out there capable of ensnaring Uzume in their genjutsu. The Aiwa girl would probably have an easier time going after Shori with her genjutsu. He had the Hyuga preternatural chakra control that made him highly resistant to genjutsu, but he definitely wasn't immune. Not even close. With a swing of her gunbai, Uzume sent two stone spears flying into the distance and dove right at the genjutsu girl with the weapon raised high. She backpedaled, trying to retreat from the smiling Uchiha. She dodged the girl's swing, was forced to duck underneath, and eat a kick to her face for her troubles. A wall rose between Uzume and her target, but she would not be denied. With a heave-ho, she sliced through the wall, and continued her approach. Her war fan arched down to deal the final blow, but the redhead substituted with his teammate. Uzume dove backwards and barely managed to dodge out of the way of the flood of lava sent her way. Back at square one, she gritted her teeth and lifted the war fan again. Shori weaved seals at a rapid pace, only just managing to keep the duo of Kumo Nin away from him with rapid ninjutsu. He'd abandoned the use of earth release after they proved more than willing to slice through whatever he sent with lightning-natured chakra flow. It was almost ridiculous how chakra flow was an advanced technique reserved for the more experienced Chunin, but there were 3 genin on the rooftop displaying familiarity with the technique. He'd never seen Shori use it, but he was almost certain he could. Especially since Uzume had shown proficiency with the technique. The Kumo duo dove at him, but were forced to dodge out of the way of a stream of air bullets. They were careful to prevent themselves from being separated after their first teammate had been taken down. As both fights began anew, the buzzer sounded off. 1 minute more. Almost immediately, the Kumo Nin lost all interest in Shori and made at the Aiwa position. Uzume jumped to the side to prevent being caught between both teams. I unsealed my bow. Uzume looked at me like she couldn't believe it. I just smiled at her. This was the moment. The time to prove everyone wrong. To show them exactly what I knew. I bent my back and aimed my arrow to the heavens. Breathe in. Breathe out. I loosed the arrow with my breath. It sailed in the air a few meters before sharply banking downwards. One thing I'd learned early on in life was that I did not have the wood release. Of course, I knew it. The clan checked. I had the right affinity, but I could just not grasp the formula for forming wood release. Whenever I tried, I'd just end up forming mud. Dirty mud. Useless mud. Whatever notes my grandfather had left on the matter had been unclear and only 2 steps away from useless. I was sure the only reason why Tobirama had never got on his ass to make better notes was the fact that they all thought he had at least a century in him when he died. The only reason the notes were just 2 steps from useless and not entirely so was because of what they meant for my arrows. The wood in each arrow was made from Hashirama trees. I held the largest private collection in trust for the Senju clan at this point. Buying shit with clan funds did tend to have that effect, even if I was buying the land from my own granduncle. His notes had taught me how to interact with the chakra he'd left behind in each of his creations. I couldn't do anything too impressive with them, but controlling the flow of an arrow telekinetically within certain limits was easy. And so the arrow defied physics and dropped on my enemies like a meteor. The second benefit of learning to interact with my grandfather's chakra appeared then. With the right set of seals, and the right amount of chakra control, I could cast jutsu through the arrows at distance. I snapped my fingers and one arrow became dozens. The Kumo and Iwa Nin, previously on the edge of fighting again, scattered to avoid the attack. The Tsuchikage's grandson slammed his palms on the ground and formed a dome of earth to protect both himself and the flag from my attack. Game. Set. Match. I thought to myself as I snapped my fingers once more. The arrows, already airborne, glowed with blue chakra as I activated rudimentary wind-natured chakra flow on a few of them. The few set to hit his dome. Perhaps it was the shouted warning from his teammate, or maybe it was something from his own senses, but I felt Kitsuchi hurriedly use a substitution jutsu to escape the death trap he'd made for himself. My arrows tore through the dome and much of the surrounding landscape. In the face of awestruck opponents, I substituted with one of my arrows eating the chakra feedback with nothing but a grimace, and grabbed a hold of the flag. The horn blared one final time at the exact same time as I lifted the flag for all to see. The flag, red as the armor I wore. The reaction was instant. If there was one thing that could get civilians fired up, it was ninja magic that happened too quickly for them to truly understand but slowly enough for them to tell themselves that they did. They chanted my name. Not my first name, that would have been a tall ask, but my last name. Senju, 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 their voices screamed to the heavens. Not just the Konoha civilians, even. I could see some who had accused me of cheating after that prank at the end of the first stage, joining others in screaming my name. It was a heady feeling, I could not deny. And I stood there, enjoying it. There was someone by my side. I turned to see Uzume looking at me with a raised eyebrow. Don't let it get to your head, silly boy. They scream your name now, but they'll scream even louder to see you lose your head later, she said. I nodded at her. We turned as one and began to make our way back to Toshiro. Jiraiya was saying something. I couldn't pick out the words, but I could see the display on the board. Team Shorirama 389 points. Team Kitsuchi 218 points. Team B 210 points. Team Uraum 200 points. Team Izuku 174 points. Izuku's team only had a few points above Shikahime's. Clearly a result of her points only beginning to count after she showed herself on the hill, while Izuku's team had been there much longer. It was also interesting to note that Uraum had won the battle royale for the flag on the field. It was something I had never actually seen coming. I knew she was strong. Her entire team was respectably strong for a team of genin, but I wouldn't have thought open combat to be a specialty of theirs. Toshiro noticed where my attention was when he joined Uzume and I. I smiled as he handed my scroll to me and began to speak. Uraum's team was a massive surprise in that they managed to keep hold of the flag for so long. They did lose it to Choni and Inoken for a bit. And then Kizaru and Izuku stole it from those two. Izuku had the time of his life fighting off all comers, while Kizaru kept it hidden with genjutsu. They actually looked to be about to win the whole thing, and then Uraum was able to lead her teammates through Kizaru's genjutsu while Izuku was occupied with fighting everyone else. 3 against 1, he never stood a chance. The buzzer rang immediately subsequently, and Uraum just began to twirl and created this dome of chakra barrier around herself and the flag. No one could get close until the event was over. I nodded at his explanation. I've never seen you use your arrows like that, he said to me. Of course, I have a few tricks up my sleeves. I said in reply. Ladies and gentlemen, an urgent statement from the cage box. Jiraiya's voice rang out louder than before, and sent a hush through the crowd. I could spot my granduncle's hat, but little else with how far away I was. He walked forward, to the edge of the box. I applauded the fact that he was bold enough to have his back to 4 of the strongest shinobi in the entire world. But if I was being honest with myself, I knew as surely as I knew anything that there was no way my granduncle would have the real him in that kill box. It was probably a shadow clone. The real him would be close, but not in that kind of position. Genin of the elemental nations. You have been more than exemplary today. Phenomenal. Amazing. Spectacular. Superb. There are 1,000,001 appellations I could bestow upon you all, and each of them would be equally fitting. Needless to say, you have all done your countries proud. Raise your shoulders high for that fact alone. You have all done me proud as well. From my grandson and heir to Jodi Siwa of Kusagakure, each of you has shown me that the faith my brother held in the upcoming generations was not misplaced. I underestimated you all in my planning. I expected this to be an event that could be crammed into a single day. Credit to you all for proving an old man like me wrong. I was wrong. The day already goes late, and after the passionate exhibition we've seen, I dare say most of you would be more than exhausted. He paused at that, and I would have sworn his attention was on me for that second. He was right, though. Between the barrier and the stunt with the arrows, I was mostly tapped out. Because of that, I proposed an idea to my fellow Cage. One they were more than willing to accept. The event will be paused for today, and resume in the morning tomorrow with the third and final stage of tournament. To make it up to you for taking even more of your time, my fellow Cage have agreed to my other proposal. Whosoever emerges as the victor from tomorrow's tournament will have begun the day as a genin but ended it as a chunin. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the chunin exams. Genin, may the odds be ever in your favor, he said. The excitement was tangible. I would struggle to cut it with a kunai if I tried, it was so thick. He returned to his seat to rapturous applause, and all around me were whispers and murmured conversations. I turned to my teammates, about to say something. Save it. See you tomorrow, silly boy. Uzume disappeared in a shunshin. I smiled fondly, and followed her lead. Granduncle had been right. It was getting late. Already early evening, I was eager to get home and find myself something to eat. There wasn't much training I could do with how tired I was, and how late the day was already getting. That meant I returned home plain to have a quick dinner and go to bed. Hopefully, waking up earlier tomorrow would give me time to strategize against my probable opponents for the tournament. I went to the academy with 8 of the other participants, and had spent some time fighting another 3. The Iowa team were the ones I knew the least about, but I'd still got the chance to see them fight in their grand duel with the Kumo team during the second test. I knew Red Hair had lava, the big one could use earth release almost as well as I could, and the last one was their genjutsu specialist. That was enough to make a very basic plan against each of them that would develop into something more complex as the fights went on, and I got to see more and more from them. Welcome back, Shorirama-sama. I waved the Hyuga orderly aside as I walked in to begin working on my dinner. Cooking was a hobby from my old life, and I'd quickly learned that the best food I'd be getting in this house was what I made myself. My mother had an all-Hyuga household as part of her marriage agreement, and for some reason, the Hyuga seemed to prefer their food being as bland as their personalities. Your mother wants to see you, I heard one of them say, and turned abruptly. It couldn't be me that she was talking to, but the words were clearly addressed to me. Who? Surely, I'd misheard. Your mother, the Lady Hinori-sama. She has asked to see you, she clarified, but the words still made no sense to me. No sense at all. You must be mistaken, I said, turning away. She clearly made her intentions known to me. She asked that I have you sent up to her room the moment you returned. She said again. Swear it. Swear it on your life, I demanded. I swear. I turned away from the kitchen, appetite fleeing as quickly as a Tashiro's composure in the face of a beautiful woman. My house was one of the largest in the Senju compound. It was a wide duplex that spanned a massive amount of land. It was built in the traditional Senju style out of wood that resonated with me whenever I placed my fingers on it. Hashirama had built it himself. The ground floor held the servant quarters and kitchens, while the top floor was where the family was supposed to reside. My mother had the whole east wing to herself. An art room, a music room, a library, and massive bedrooms to ensure that everything she possibly needed was within the home for her. I stayed in the west wing. There were 7 bedrooms in the west wing. I stayed in the same one I'd always stayed in. One of the other rooms used to belong to my nanny, but I'd outgrown having one once I joined the academy. So the rest of the wing was empty. The truth was, beyond the staff, the house was mostly empty most of the time. The staff that I didn't know as well as I probably should have. It wasn't entirely my fault since mother had them switched out every year or so and I only really came here to sleep. The rest of my time was spent in either Grandma Mito's place, or the clan library. Not to talk of the time spent on missions or training. On getting upstairs, I moved right to the east wing. Left, right, left, I never paid such close attention to my feet before. Did I always walk so loudly? It felt like every step I took on the wooden floorboards creaked. I couldn't even apply chakra to my feet to deaden the sounds like I instinctively would. Mother was chakra sensitive to an extreme level. I am in here. Come on in. I heard her voice from the art room, and walked in to find her bent over staring at a painting. It was of a red sun, overlooking the village. Leaning to the side to look out the window in front of the easel showed that it was how the village presently looked in the sunset. Beyond the color of the sun, of course. Walking closer, I could notice a few differences. For one, some buildings were missing. Either missing, or replaced with something else. It seemed almost random, for a few seconds, at least. Before I noticed what all those buildings had in common. The Hokage Tower was replaced with a playground. The academy was gone. It was just another generic flat building. The barracks were also missing. Same with the village armory. She'd removed everything that identified Konoha as a shinobi village. It is good to see you so well, Mother, I said when I noticed the silence between us had grown awkward. She hummed in reply. When I feared that this was going to turn into one of those, she spoke again. I saw your performance at the exhibition, she started. Indeed. I wasn't aware that you left home, I replied. I hadn't seen her in the crowd either. Sure, I hadn't been paying that much attention, but something told me I would have noticed the Hyuga princess's presence if she'd shown up. Mother would be the center of attention in any building she walked into. There would have been too many people staring at her in the stadium for me not to notice. She pointed behind me, and I noted a screen on the wall. It looked like a television from my past life. I walked forward and noticed it was covered in seals. Your grandmother dropped this off this morning. She was very insistent that we watch your performance together. Would not take no for an answer, she said, and I swallowed a chuckle. That sounded precisely like Mito. I hope you enjoyed the show, then, I said. You have grown strong. Much stronger than either your father and I were at your age. Your grandmother says you remind her of her husband sometimes, she replied, and I resisted the urge to preen at the praise. I wasn't a pre-teen. I was above this. But somehow, it seemed like I wasn't. Against my will, I felt warmth bloom in my chest. I detested the control this woman had over me. Thank you, I said with a bow. To not acknowledge the compliment would have been rude. When in doubt, lean on Hyuga etiquette training to get through things. Quit. What? Quit what? Being a shinobi. I saw it with my own eyes today. You are strong, you will be one of the strongest in your prime, but that is not a good thing. Strength invites challenge. It was your father's strength that made Iwa send a kill squad after him, even when the war was basically already over. It was your grandfather's strength that had assassin after assassin sent after him until his body could just no longer keep up. Hold on, where are you going? Come back here, Hashirama. I am your mother. I command you to come back here. Her voice was drowned out as I slammed the door to the house behind me. XXXXX. He wanted to say he had a tough night of sleeping. That his mother's words kept him up thinking about what she said and what she wanted. But that would have been a lie. He slept like a baby. The second he'd arrived at Grandmother Mito's place and gone up to his room, he'd lost consciousness from the moment his head hit the table. In fact, he had to be woken up to have dinner because no one could sleep in Grandmother's place and dare skip a meal. It was anathema to her, the very suggestion. And so, half asleep, he'd been forced to sit through dinner with his cousin and their shared grandmother. He'd even been so tired that he'd been unable to tease Tsunade about the reason she'd been spending more and more time at their grandmother's place. Those were regrets of yesterday, however. This was a new day. A new day for him to etch his name on the history books. It made him sometimes wonder why was the way he was. His mother's words had not affected him all through the night, but they were the first thing he thought of on waking up. He'd enrolled at the Shinobi Academy and trained his head off to ensure his survival in the wars to come, but was that really necessary? Did he really need to bother about things like that? His mother was right, in a way. He could retire right now and become a civilian. The Senju clan had resources aplenty that would see him live in luxury for the rest of his days. As for being sent out in war, he was sure that Tobirama would not be so cruel as to send his civilian nephew off to war. Hiruzen definitely wasn't going to do that with the head of the Senju clan. Literally, all his problems would be solved if he quit now. And then he closed his eyes and the thought of a red moon brought him back to reality. In canon, Naruto and Sasuke had done a good job of dealing with that, but so many things had come down to luck in the end. What was the guarantee that Kakashi would exist in this universe? Or what was the guarantee that he'd be the same kind of person? There was none. There were so many things that could go wrong. So many ways that Naruto and Sasuke could fail to exist. Did my presence mean that Mito would live for a bit longer and then Kushina won't be called from Uzushiogakure in time to be teammates with Minato? Did my presence mean that Tsukumo would not meet his wife? Maybe even being a sensei to my team had butterflied the man into being a better father to his son. So Kakashi would be less of an asshole, and so Obito would never die, meaning no Kakashi of the Sharingan and no sensei for Team 7. I realized it then as I stood up. It was too late. Much too late. Too late for second thoughts and too late for me to reconsider my path. Onwards and upwards, it had to be. And today was step 1. I made the decision then to ignore whatever words Hinori Hyuga had for me. My mother had died on the same day as my father. I walked out of the room to go down for breakfast and shockingly found the table already set in full. You woke up quite late, didn't you, cousin? Tsunade asked as I sat down. And you're still here, cousin. I wonder why. Is your mum still throwing up all through the night? I asked with a snicker. Enough, children. Shori, eat up. You have a day ahead of you, Mito cut in, and I nodded before digging into the healthy breakfast spread arrayed before me. There was so much variety that the meal was more reminiscent of a feast than just a simple breakfast for 3. We all had healthy appetites, however. Grandmother said it was the Uzumaki blood that flowed through our veins, but part of me was certain she just used it as an excuse to be a glutton. After finishing breakfast, I wasted no time heading back to my room to put on my armor. Grandmother had commissioned it for me the second she'd found out about the exams, and it was a masterpiece. Only a true master of Fuinjutsu would be able to decipher all the seals on the armor. Even I had issues with them. I couldn't quite figure out the matrix that made wearing the armor feel as comfortable and light as wearing silk. There were also seals that made the armor much sturdier than it would have otherwise been. That didn't even include the multiple, complex storage seals along the armor's frame that held surprises for anyone who wasn't vigilant enough. 5 teams qualified, but only 14 genin will be moving on to the final round. We regret to inform you that Inasa of Kumogakure perished from his wounds at the hospital last night. Please remember him in your prayers tonight. Moving on, with 14 genin, the first round of the tournament will have 7 one-on-one fights. That will create a quarterfinal round where one genin chosen at random will have to fight twice to secure their slot in the semifinal round. Jiraiya announced as the final round was about to begin. I blinked at his words. The only Kumo genin who was missing from the lineup was the one that I'd taken down during the second round. I didn't kill him. I couldn't have. I wasn't aiming to kill, only to disable. Surely, the hospital should have been more than well equipped enough to deal with the injuries dealt. The rules for this round are simple. Both parties will fight until one either forfeits or is unable to continue. Death, immobilization with no visible escape prospects, or unconsciousness all qualify as situations where the referee can declare a candidate unfit to continue. Yoroi spoke next in his simple tone before leaning backwards. Now, if you would turn your attention to the screen, our first fight is about to be drawn, Jiraiya said. The screen flipped through names at high speed, very reminiscent of those casino machines. It finally began to slow down after close to a minute. The names became more visible until it stopped at 2 names: Takehata Toshiro vs. C. The female teammate of the genin I'd apparently killed in the previous round looked towards where I and my team stood with a sharp smile on her face. Oops. Would everyone except the chosen candidates take a step back and return to the waiting area? The referee asked, appearing behind us suddenly. It was only at that moment that I actually realized who'd been chosen to referee this thing. My cousin's second roommate. In all his pale-faced and yellow-eyed snaky glory. Be careful, Toshiro. She's out for blood, I whispered to him before I joined everyone else in moving towards the waiting area. While I had been consumed with my progress, Toshiro had gone and become a real threat to be feared, I thought to myself with a smile. He ran at sea with speed that anyone from our graduating class would have been shocked to see come from him. He ducked under her blade and lashed out with a fist towards her head. His attack came from the left, and she weaved right into its path like she was dodging an attack from the right. Moving right into the attack amplified its force, and she was sent flying from the blow. Sealess genjutsu, I thought with an appreciative gasp. She took the hit much better than I would have expected from her frame, and she stood before Toshiro could press the advantage. Nay, I corrected myself. He allowed her to stand up and chose not to press his advantage. How chivalrous. She weaved a familiar set of seals, and I smiled to see Toshiro react to the jutsu before she'd even got the chance to complete it. I'd used it on him in a training session before, after all. Her electromagnetic murder tore through the ground that separated them, but only managed to hit a log that erupted in smoke. Smoke that spread across the field much too quickly to be natural. Smoke bombs spread across the field, I deduced. But when there's a rock clone under Maiseigakur no Jutsu doing his bidding in the field, Uzume said by my side. I nodded at her. So that was how he'd spread the smoke bombs. Probably set them all to trigger at precisely the right moment. There was a buzzing sound from the smoke-covered field, and I noted a single steady flash of light coming from the smoke. C was clearly wielding her blade now. Enhancing it with lightning release chakra flow was likely aimed at using it in figuring out his approach. I turned to the screen and noted that the view had become black and white as the receptors used a different means to peg down the movement of each party. We could clearly see Toshiro moving slowly across the mist. Creeping, really, while C turned here and there, waving her sword to ward off attacks that just weren't coming. A paranoia-inducing genjutsu, I suspected, as I noted her walk right out of her previously holdable position and into Toshiro's path. Toshiro leaned backwards to avoid the first swipe of her blade. She turned to the left to stab at thin air, while Toshiro came in from the right and grabbed a hold of her sword arm before harshly pulling it towards him and snapping it in the same movement. She dropped her blade with a scream we could hear from up here. He wasted no time in following through with the attack and lashed out with a headbutt. Her headband's placement around her neck was a mistake she wouldn't be making again, as she staggered backwards, dazed. She tried to lash out with a lick that he just dodged around before unloading into her midsection with 2 heavy punches. Backwards she went again, and he weaved one last set of seals. Water release. Water bullet. He spat out a compressed ball of water that sent his opponent into unconsciousness. Seconds later, Orochimaru weaved a single seal and breathed out a gust of wind that dispersed the smoke in one go. He stared at the Kumo Genin's form for a second before pointing right at Toshiro. The entire stadium erupted in applause. I was right there with them, clapping and screaming his praises. I guess it was clear that he hadn't needed my warnings. He'd had things well in hand. The screen flashed through the list of names once more before it settled on 2 names, Hyuga Hinori and Aburame Shiba. But they're on the same team, I heard Omoikane speak out with dread in his voice. I understood where he was coming from, even if I could not understand the surprise in his voice. Fighting one's teammates must have been a much scarier prospect for teams that had real unity between the members, but surely, he should have foreseen the chances of this happening in a random draw. Both my cousin and her teammate left the tunnel together. It was an impressive display of unity, as they then stood opposite each other and made the seal of confrontation without being prompted. The second they finished, Shiba returned his fingers to their usual position in the deep pockets of his overcoat. I'd been very critical of the clothing choice, especially in the Land of Fire's notoriously hot summers, until Shiba has brought me a jacket made of the same material for my birthday last year. It was so breathable and airy, that it felt like magic. It was also incredibly light, so I'd figured that the overcoat must have been a non-consideration for them. Orochimaru dropped his hand to start off the fight, and Hinori was forced to jump backwards as a swarm of bugs slammed into the area of the ground she'd been standing on. She weaved 2 seals and Shiba bent at the waist to avoid a blade of cutting blade that she breathed out and directed in his direction. It had no effect beyond slowing him down, and that was all the time my cousin needed to cover the distance between the both of them and stab her fingers in his direction. After 2 palms, the body collapsed in a swarm of Kikaichu, and Hinori had the honor of being surrounded by the chakra-draining insects. She reacted quickly, activating her Kaden and sending the bugs flying. When she left the jutsu, it was to bugs ripping themselves out of the ground and rushing at her. They tore through her body in a gruesome display of flesh and blood that I allowed myself experience for a second before I tore through the genjutsu with ease. It was a rock clone in her place. Shiba himself had not been fooled by the genjutsu, and they stood across from one another in another standoff. I forfeit, Shiba Aburame suddenly said, lifting his hand. Only the close attention I'd been placing on Uraum helped me notice how she did not feel the slightest bit surprised at her teammate's seemingly sudden decision to resign. This was planned. I could see how it must have been concocted. Team training would have told them who was the strongest between them, and so the other would put on a good show to avoid dishonoring their clan and village. Then they'd resign to preserve their team's best candidate's chances of going on to win the whole thing. If this was the kind of Chunin exam that I'd seen in the manga, then this alone might have been enough to cinch his promotion. I looked at both my teammates sitting next to me and chuckled. No way was either of them going to take a deal like that. The crowd applauded at the Aburame boy, even if most of them were confused as to what had happened. To them, it must have been especially jarring. 1 second, the Hyuga girl was on the ropes, being eaten to death, and then the next she was perfectly fine, and her opponent was surrendering to her. A beautiful performance in the end. Just to clarify what we saw over there, Hyuga Hinori did use an illusion technique to make it look like she'd been caught in the trap. She actually escaped and replaced herself with a mud clone. Jiraiya's voice rang out, and the civilians began whispering to themselves, even more awed by the display of ninja magic. Now, for our next match. He trailed off as the screen began to flash through a list of names. It took a shorter time to make its choice with fewer options to run through, and came to a stop with 2 names on the screen, Kitsuchi of Iowa and Sarutobi Omoikane. Please make your way to the field, Jiraiya announced. I smiled at the matchup and leaned forwards. It was a good chance to see what the Tsuchikage's son was capable of in his teen years. He was also well into his teens, at least 13 years of age. That meant he had a good 2 years on most of the participants here. The only people here who were close to his age were his teammates. The bicolored hair boy from Kumo was even younger than I was, and his teammate was only a year older than me from appearances alone. Their third had been at last 16, but he was apparently gone from the contest already. Both of the participants were on the field facing each other in no time. I hoped Omoikane would win this and claim victory for Konoha, but Uzume had fought him, and if the look she was giving to the battle was any indication, then Omoikane would stand little chance. The second Orochimaru began the battle, Omoikane was off. His fingers flew through seals at a rapid pace, and a giant fireball blasted through the space between them. Kitsuchi had wasted no time in weaving his seals. He bent on his knees and dropped his palms on the floor. A wall rose in time to meet the fireball. The explosive power of the powerful fire jutsu was enough to destroy sections of the wall, but Kitsuchi was well and truly covered from the attack. After the fireball came a ton of smoke, however. Smoke that Omoikane disappeared into almost immediately. A stirring in the smoke was Kitsuchi's only sign that something was coming for him, but he reacted admirable. He turned in time to fire off a stone bullet that tore through Omoikane's jacket and the kunai it was tied to. Omoikane swept in from the other side and slammed Kitsuchi's head against his wall with a powerful kick that was sure to send anyone reeling. He took advantage of the opportunity and reared up to stab down with his kunai. From the screen, I could see Kitsuchi's hands touch the ground and go deeper into the ground. By the time Omoikane's kunai was about to hit, he must have felt shocked to feel his body fold around Kitsuchi's fist. The boy was fast, especially at that size. Omoikane spat out a wad of blood before Kitsuchi pushed further with his fist and sent the boy flying. He rose from his knees, still unsteady, but his opponent was not in any place to take advantage of that. Kitsuchi scowled at Omoikane, a savage, bloody smile that showed that he'd had a few teeth knocked loose by that kick into the wall. He weaved seals and then spat out a single mud bullet. It crashed into Omoikane's form and sent him flying back further, but no other reaction. The boy was clearly unconscious already. Winner. Kitsuchi of Iwagakure, Orochimaru said. That message didn't seem to get into Kitsuchi's rock-hard skull because he began weaving seals for another mud bullet. I made to jump down but felt a hand on my own. I looked down to see Toshiro holding on to me with a warning look on his face. I heard a commotion and turned to see that Izuku had made it out of his seat, but Kizaru was holding him back while Uzume blocked his path so he couldn't jump down. In the end, our intervention was unnecessary. Orochimaru would not let his sensei's clansmen be killed in front of him. The next mud bullet was slapped aside with a flick of his hand as he appeared between Kitsuchi and his target. I declared you the winner already, in case you are hard of hearing. Move again and lose your hands, the snake Sanin hissed with menace in his voice. The threat was clear there. Kitsuchi, finally finding his wits, nodded and walked away from the field. He turned to his teammate and whispered, "Good luck," to her as she stood from her seat to walk towards the battlefield. The fact that her chosen opponent was Inuzuka Inokuro must have brought no small amount of joy to her. She'd enjoyed kicking his ass back in the academy, and she was probably going to love doing it even more now that she had an audience here. At least more of an audience than she was used to from the academy matches. He watched the two of them face off at the center of the field, and already the Inuzuka boy had opened his mouth to say something. He couldn't quite catch the words, but he could catch the way Uzume's smile lightened in the close-up of her face on the screen. The screen panned out from that view to show both candidates facing each other and making the seal of confrontation. As Orochimaru dropped his hand, there was no movement from either party before Inokuro suddenly began screaming while scratching at his ears, and nose, and even eyes. The idiot had looked Uzume right in her eyes. What a fool. Always assume that your opponent has got stronger. The fact that she hadn't been able to use Sharingan Genjutsu back in the academy shouldn't have been enough to make him let his guard down like that. By his side, Shiro leapt up and nipped at his ear with a harsh bark. He snapped out of the Genjutsu instantly, scowling at her and barking something to his companion. He clearly wasn't pleased with the public humiliation, especially since Uzume had not bothered to even take advantage of the time he'd been incapacitated for. Shiro barked back, and both man and beast assumed similar positions, staring down Uzume. She merely stretched out one hand and made a "come here" gesture that they were all too happy to heed. They covered the space between them and her with impressive speed, and she acted just as quickly. The first claw that was sent at her throat was dodged with a quick backwards lean. Shiro jumped at her, but was too slow, as she'd been able to correct her stance and place her gunbai between her and the dog. He slammed into the war fan just as she pushed out with it. Both the dog and his human companion were sent flying by the wind release imbued into the weapon. Inokuro was quick enough on his feet to flip with the wind's momentum and then stop himself by planting his claws in the ground. He came to a skidding stop a few minutes later. His canine competition did the same thing by his side and they both snarled at their opponent who was still smirking at them. She tossed her fan into the air with one movement while bringing both hands together in a ram seal and breathing in. Almost as if to prove a point, she used the same jutsu Omoikane had used in his fight, but with only a single seal, and to far greater effect. The fireball that flew for the man and dog duo was at least the size of a small house and moved as quickly as a train. They moved to dodge immediately, but the difference between man and beast showed itself. Kuro was able to make it out of the attack's path, but his friend was not. The attack slammed into the dog and exploded, sending him flying into the stadium's wall. He collapsed, unmoving. My heart stalled in my chest. Uzume wouldn't dare. No, not with the clanhead's son. She wouldn't be so stupid. It was almost like the entire stadium let out a breath it didn't know it had been holding when the dog's chest began to move. You bitch! Kuro snarled at Uzume. His voice was so loud that even this far away, I could hear him. You'll pay for that, Gatsuga! He screamed and then began to spin. He covered the space between them with even greater speed than the first time. She dodged out of the way of that attack, but he would not be deterred. It was like a game of whack-a-mole, as Uzume moved quickly to make sure she wasn't in the path of the dangerous spinning attacks. He was like a whirlwind of grinding movement that was sure to rip apart anything he came in contact with. I could see a few ways for Uzume to get out of this situation. The fireball she sent simply washed across his spinning form, doing nothing to stop or even deflect his momentum. The most obvious solution was the sitting duck, laying at the edge of the battlefield. Threaten the dog, and the Inuzuka would surrender almost instantly. Of course, it wasn't going to make her very popular with the watching crowd. She dodged out of the way of another attempt by the Inuzuka, and then turned to meet him as he came sweeping around again. This time, in her hand was a quickly condensing ball of spinning chakra. She wouldn't. Fuck. She did. Rasengan and spinning Inuzuka met midair, and only one spinning motion could win. He was sent flying away as the Rasengan overpowered his jutsu and exploded right in his face. Winner. Uzume Uchiha, Orochimaru said with a tone in his voice that I did not quite like. I also did not like the look he was giving her as she was walking away from the field. I calmed myself with the knowledge that we still had decades before he turned traitor. He was still a teenager now. A teenager that was loyal to Konoha. He'd never do anything to hurt Uzume. I contented myself with that information and made sure to scowl down at Uzume when she looked up at me. The smile she sent back reeked of smugness. Of course, she'd launch my own jutsu before me on the global stage. I wanted to glare at Tsukumo for making me teach it to her in the first place, but he was nowhere to be found. The fucking bastard haggled better than a fisherman's wife. The fifth fight was nothing like the four that preceded it. Instead of a battle of taijutsu, or even ninjutsu to awe the spectators, we instead got to see something arguably even more impressive, but only to the discerning. Kizaru Kurama had been drawn against a kunoichi from Iowa that went by the name Shiki. She was the one who had the brilliant idea of trying to trap an Uchiha with a fly-matured Sharingan in Genjutsu. Something of a Genjutsu specialist, but Uzume hadn't been particularly kind when she referred to her abilities as middling. At least, she hadn't meant to be kind, but at the end of the day, even that much recognition from Uzume might as well have been high praise. My team was well accustomed to Genjutsu, both in detection and usage. Tsukumo-sensei had a habit of weaving powerful Genjutsu into his taijutsu and kenjutsu, in much the same way Toshiro had done in his fight with that sea girl, but with loads more finesse and skill. Needless to say, even with our natural abilities, both Uzume and I had been forced to do a lot of work to be able to largely ignore his plethora of Genjutsu in combat. Toshiro, even without those talents, was still the most skilled non-clan Genjutsu user I knew of. That changed today, however. Uzume had undersold things. On getting to the battlefield, Kizaru had wasted no time in taking out his flute. The same flute I'd bought him all those years ago and began to play. The sound waves weren't traveling so far as to catch us in the Genjutsu as well, but I could tell that it was one of his stronger variants from the sheer chakra expenditure. On the other hand, the girl weaved seal after seal as she transitioned from one Genjutsu to another. I could only imagine what was going on between the two of them. What each of them was seeing as the other ensnared them in their Genjutsu, and then held them there while they tried to break out to ensnare the other. It must have been like a dance. Dance with mental techniques like that must have been an experience for the memories. I knew I'd never have something so beautiful happen to me. I could cast Genjutsu at Chunin level, but people like Toshiro, Uzume, Izuku, and most definitely Kizaru had me beat in that aspect of them shinobi arts. Despite having Tsunade as a cousin, my chakra control wasn't necessarily anything to write a tale about. Certainly, not good enough to overcome the advantages my peers had, either by nature or by hard work. I could admit it. Toshiro worked harder than me when it came to Genjutsu. He didn't have much in the way of ninjutsu to rely on, so it was perhaps unavailable for him to dedicate most of his energy to the art. I left my thoughts to return to the fight before me as I saw the Iowa girl drop to her knees with blood streaming from her nostrils. Her black hair fell around her in ringlets that frames her face and added something truly savage to her appearance. Despite the problems, however, she still maintained her grasp on her handseal as she desperately tried to maintain her contest with Kizaru in the battle for Genjutsu supremacy. On the other hand, Kizaru had an almost relaxed look on his face as he played the flute with an adeptness that only a true master of their craft would. I'd heard Kizaru play for entertainment at many a gathering, and I knew what it must have sounded like to the Iowa kunoichi in the thrall of his Genjutsu. He had a preference for slow, haunting tunes when he added Genjutsu to his music, but his range was not limited to that. No, there was an interesting one that had a frenzied upbeat tone that drove all who listened to it into a wild frenzy, allegedly. I'd never got the chance to see that one in person, but Izuku had a talent for description. There was also a fast, but soothing tone that somehow induced paranoia in all who heard it. Izuku had narrated the tale of how they'd used only that genjutsu to perform a bandit extermination mission. The bandits had begun to fight amongst themselves, under the sway of Kizuru's genjutsu, and then eventually slaughtered each other down to a man. The light in Izuku's eyes as he described the gory scene would have made me worried if I didn't feel much the same excitement at the thought of such effective genjutsu. Kizuru lived up to all the hype that had been made of his abilities, and systematically disabled Shiki of Iwa with an ease that belied the complexity of the art. He maintained his playing, until he switched his tone suddenly. His movements became much slower. Slow and methodical. His fingers moved across the flute at an almost languid pace. The effects on his opponent were immediately apparent. She formed the release seal multiple times with an unmistakable look of panic etched on her face. It didn't work. One of her fingers dropped uselessly to the ground. She formed the seal with one hand. Began to scream, "Release." The fact that I could hear it from here spoke to how loudly she must have been screaming it. She suddenly coughed out blood. And then began to scream. But this time, not any discernible words. Just screams of terror. Screams that got so loud that I feared she'd tear her vocal cords from exertion, until it all came to a sudden, abrupt stop. She collapsed to the floor, unconscious. Orochimaru declared Kizuru the winner, but he did not acknowledge it, and merely continued to play the piece until he reached its end. The chakra flowing from him had cut off after she collapsed, so it was clear there was no genjutsu involved here. Just an artist wanting to complete his craft. It was all the best that he did not stop. The end to the fight had been jarring enough that the civilians, and even the shinobi in the stands, merely stared at the field. Jiraiya's attempts to stir some excitement for Kizuru's victory fell flat. No one would be forgetting the sight of the pale Iwa girl lying on the floor with blood running from her nose and mouth anytime soon. The image was practically seared in all our memories. Shorirama Senju versus Izuku Uchiha, Jiraiya proclaimed, and I turned to my best friend with a feeling in my chest that I couldn't quite place. I wanted to fight Izuku. Of course, I did. But I would rather not fight him as my first fight of the third stage. For some reason, a delusional part of me had been hoping to face him in the finals. My ideal route there had been to face one Jinchuriki after the other, and then Uzume, before fighting my best friend on the biggest stage we'd ever get. We'd have written our names in the history books, and now one of us would be forced to be relegated as nothing but a footnote. Someone who lost in the first round would have no chance of being remembered. Virtually no chance of being anything more than an aside. No matter how strong they were or how well they fought, it would all end up coming for naught in the end. It pained me that this would be the fate I'd have to sentence Izuku to. But that was the way of this world. I stood from my seat, and didn't bother taking the stairs down to use the tunnel to get to the battlefield. I simply stared over the ledge for a second and then jumped. I prepped my feet and knees with chakra before I landed, and did so with barely a whisper. The crowd burst into whispers at my entrance. Whispers that intensified as Izuku copied my exact movements a second later. Well, you can tell they're excited to get things going. This is going to be a doozy, ladies and gentlemen. In no time, we were standing on the field and facing each other. Orochimaru's hand dropped, and I crushed the tendrils of chakra that reached out to my chakra system with a savagery that I didn't quite feel. I ran at him, and he mirrored my movements. My eyes met his, but my chakra denied every attempt he made to place me under genjutsu. Hyuga genes for the win. Normally, I'd let myself be ensnared by the genjutsu for a second or so out of pure curiosity, but that urge had been beaten out of me by sensei, and Izuku was not an opponent I could take risks with regarded. I made the first attack as custom. 2 fingers lashed out for his forehead, aiming to scramble his brain and send him into unconsciousness. With a single movement, he forced his forehead protector down from its position as a hairband to his forehead. My fingers hit the cold metal, and he took advantage with a kick aimed at my midsection. I leaned around the limb, flexibility from years of dance training coming in clutch. I rushed in again. one finger moving for his shoulder in a feint that he ignored, while the real attack aimed at his solar plexus was dodged. He'd fought me enough times to know that blocking me was a terrible idea. It irritated me how he danced around every attack aimed at him, while preventing me from getting into a real groove by forcing me to have to deal with his counterattacks. I weaved past a quick 1, 2, and poked at his eyes with my fingers. He leaned backwards, but not in the same way as before. Most would not have caught it. But there was a flash of panic in his movements. A 1-second loss of composure. But one that I would punish. It had left him full of holes. 2 palm, 4 palm, 8 palms, 16. I only got so far before he managed to throw himself out of the way of my attacks. I scowled at the failure. It was only my lack of the Byakugan that prevented that from being a fight-ending combo. I was sure that I'd probably got no less than 8 or so Tenketsu, but a full Hyuga would have got all 16 that they aimed for. That has to hurt, I said, burying the frustration at having victory torn from my grasp so abruptly. It does, he said with a smile. And then he formed the tiger seal. I smiled and clapped my palms together. Fire release. Phoenix flower jutsu, he said, sending a barrage of basketball-sized fireballs my way. I smiled and took a deep breath before kneading my chakra, just as Tobirama had taught me to. Water release. Great water mass bullet. Using only my affinity for water releaser and my large chakra capacity, I created 5 massive water bullets that tore through his fireballs without so much as a stutter before converging on his position. He jumped backwards before running across the field to dodge out of the way of the bullets. The first bullet landed right at his heels, failing to meet him by just a hair's breadth. The second hit nothing but air as he bent his knees before jumping right over the bullet heading for him. The third tore through his body, but there were only wood splinters left at the impact site. I tracked him to the small field of trees at the edge of the battlefield and commanded the remaining 2 to curve to his position in a pincer. They did, but he was more than content to dodge at the last second and allow both to crash into each other. I reached out to the water created by my chakra, and commanded it to harden. The water droplets that fell turned into a series of needles that tore through the rock clone he'd substituted with. I cursed myself for getting open-handed and teaching everyone that jutsu. But thankfully, I hadn't taught them this one. I formed a ram seal and molded my chakra. All around the battlefield, the water puddles created by my jutsu stirred before rising and taking my shape. Water release. Water clone jutsu complete. Each of them ran at Izuku's position in the forest, acting as a distraction while I completed the final stage of my plan. FTER reading this, you can either wait till next week for the next chapter or read the next 3 on Patreon right now and keep reading as I write. For the Patreon, you can remove the hyphen between Pa and Trian and Google it, then search for my username Oganevogaga. Or you could copy the link in my bio and remove the spaces before pasting in your address bar. Have fun with this also. In case you haven't checked out my other story, Gamer of the Desert, yet, then please do so. It's also set in the Naruto universe. It's an SI into Gaara with some gamer elements. I can guarantee you'll love it. It's also much farther along than this one, so gives you something to really sink your teeth into. He rushed out of the forest, keen to avoid being drawn into a battle of attrition and surrounded by my clones. In much the same vein, they rushed at him, but they were water clones at the end of the day. Each one of them only about 30% as powerful as I was. That meant they were all 70% slower, weaker, and dumber. They ran at him headlong, and the Uchiha show-off jumped into the air. I struggled to describe what exactly he did, but I did know for sure that anyone who tried to do that without a Sharingan would end up tossing a shuriken in their own ass somehow. Either way, he spun in the air and tossed shuriken in every which direction, but all of them hit their mark, and my small army turned to naught but puddles of water. Finished with his maneuver, he landed on the floor with a smirk on his face. I tapped the seal on my thigh guard, unsealing a single kunai, and ran right at him. He reached down to his kunai holster and ran at me. Our kunai clashed in the middle of the arena and I met his eyes. He slashed at me again when we separated, and I ducked underneath it and tried to get him by surprise from underneath, but he blocked the attack with an easy smile on his face. He kicked at me. I leaned out of the way but did not allow him to gain distance and pushed further into his guard. Ninjutsu was an unknown. I was probably much better than he was, but I didn't know it for sure. I did know that when it came to taijutsu, I was the better. He attempted another punch out at me, and this time I allowed him to overextend before slamming my elbow down on his arm. He tried to snatch it back but was too slow as I forced him to the ground with a creative bit of footwork, and then I pointed my kunai right down at his throat to force him to surrender. He smiled at me and then leaned forward to allow the blade stab through his neck. Release! I screamed, feeling panic run through my body. I did it just in time to see the fireball heading right for me. Fuck. Domu, I didn't have the time for a handset and could barely brace myself in time, hoping my chakra made it in time to execute the jutsu. And it did. Only barely. My skin shifted consistency to turn into a darkened stone-like metal as the fireball hit me and exploded into a massive conflagration. At least my skin managed to shift for most of it. Not everywhere, I noticed. My arms were definitely burnt, and I felt the same feeling across parts of my body. My legs were the most affected in the end. The tenketsu there were some of the slowest to activate. Everywhere above the soles of my feet but below my knees stung to the high heavens. My armor had saved me from truly grievous injuries, but this was still bad. How did it happen? I knew you'd be confident about being able to detect my genjutsu. It's your one flaw, you know. For all you and my cousin piss each other off, you are both basically the same person. Your pride is everything to you. And your pride in your Hyuga blood and genjutsu resistance was something I needed to take advantage of. The Uchiha clan has existed for centuries. Do you think we had no way to place those with unnatural resistance to genjutsu under our influence all this while? He asked me with a chuckle. I scowled in reply. I knew one thing for sure, I was pissed. And also in a lot of pain. I'd stayed still since the fireball hit me. Not just because I was shell-shocked from being caught in genjutsu, but because I knew that any movement ran the risk of triggering my burns. Even worse, this wasn't something like a cut or bruise that I could fix with my limited amount of medical ninjutsu knowledge. Burns were some of the hardest injuries to heal with chakra. And that was stacked on top of the fact that medical ninjutsu was hard enough to get right on its own. I'd fucked up. Good on you to take that with so little damage, though. He said with a significant glance down at my legs. I followed his gaze. My trousers were burnt through in that area, revealing red, weeping skin. He ran right at me, perhaps sensing that I was not going to be moving much and risking aggravating my wounds for the next few rounds. But it wouldn't matter. I brought my hands together in the snake seal and stretched my neck forward after taking a deep breath to clear my airways for what was coming. Water release. Water severing wave. I needed the chakra in my stomach before converting it to water, and then spewed out the high-pressure steam. A jutsu that would have been powerful enough to cut through the roots of the god tree in a future that would never be. Izuku jumped to avoid the stream, but I simply angled my head to track him. Dissuaded from his approach, he was forced to retreat in a zigzag pattern to avoid the rapid-moving stream. He jumped into the tree line again, and I smiled before clapping both my hands together. The surrounding earth began to shake and vibrate. I formed a series of seals before ending in the tiger seal. Earth release. Earth-style rampart, I proclaimed and forced my earth into the ground beneath me to form more earth beneath my feet that lifted my half of the field a dozen feet above the base level. I could spot Izuku's irritated face at the edge of the tree line and smirked in reply. He'd have a much harder time reaching me now. I'd changed the landscape of this battle, both literally and figuratively. XXXXXXX Tsukumo Hatake. He watched his student fight with pride blooming in his chest. With this fight, he'd be the only one of the Genin sensei to have all three of their students survive to the next round of the tournament. Isn't like he frequented the Junin bars enough to brag about it, but the satisfaction was still immense. Especially when he looked towards people like Sarutobi Benzaiden, who had been very patronizing in their countless attempts to offer him advice from their wealth of expertise in training genin. Wealth of expertise that had got his team knocked out in the second round, not even making it to the tournament at the end of the day, he scoffed. It might have been counting his chickens before they hatched, but he was confident. Hashirama was injured. His legs were probably basically useless at this point. The mere act of standing still as he was must have brought untold amounts of pain. Tsukumo knew just how much burns could hurt. But the injury didn't matter. Because his student was finally taking this seriously. It showed in his transition from taijutsu to ninjutsu. Shorirama was a skilled taijutsu practitioner. His Hyuga blood would not allow him to be anything less, but the truth was that it was in ninjutsu where he really shone. And so even though he'd just watched his student get ensnared in genjutsu because of his arrogance and watched him take an unnecessary injury, Tsukumo was calm and expectant. The Uchiha boy could also read the writing on the wall, as he stayed still assessing Shorirama's position for a long while. Tsukumo would not give many people good odds against Shorirama in this situation. He knew he'd be able to just rush him and overpower him with his experience and strength, but he could think of many a Junin who would struggle to bridge this deficit. Tons of space separating him and you, and a large platform from which he could see your every move and because of which you would not be able to easily approach him. An impasse. Not one that lasted for long. Much like his cousin, Izuku Uchiha did not seem to have ample stores of patience. He formed a few seals that Tsukumo recognized and slapped his hands against the ground. He created 2 copies of himself and all 3 of them ran as one. They covered the ground at impressive speeds, but clearly not fast enough. The bird seal on Shorirama's hands made his next move obvious. All 3 forms separated as multiple air bullets smashed into their previous position. They tried to flank their opponent, one on the left, one on the right, and then one straight down the middle. Shorirama went after the one on the left first, weaving a series of seals before stretching out the first 2 fingers on his right hand. Lightning release. Lock on, a quick moving bolt of static negatively charged electricity hit the form on the right and did nothing. For a second at least. With a focused look on his face, Shorirama slashed his hand to the side. 2 separate sparks proceeded from the first form to the other 2. He was slow with the technique, but beyond that, his execution was perfect. Thereafter, I waited for the second half of the combination jutsu he'd wrangled out of me. He weaved the seals with steady hands, and then spread out both hands once he finished. I'd told him that he didn't need to make it look like he was grasping at thin air when he used it, but he'd laugh out something about the dark side of the force, and ignored me. Lightning release electromagnetic murder, he intoned, and the normally difficult to aim jutsu spread out from his fingers and chased the 3 targets. Whatever dodging was attempted failed from the beginning and in no time, lightning release chakra had stabbed through all 3 forms, dissolving all the rock clones. Tsukumo turned his attention to the base of Shorirama's section where his opponent had popped out of the ground from, and then began running up the wall. Why didn't he just continue through the platform and pop out behind him? A Chunin behind him asked another. Because of how the earth rampart jutsu works. All that earth beneath Shorirama-kun was created by his chakra. Digging through that could be a death sentence, I explained to them even though I hadn't been the one asked. Both the Chunin behind me nodded at my words, and I noticed that even more people had been paying attention to my brief explanation. It was all for the best in the end. The Earth Rampart Jutsu was one that Iwa had favored during the First War. If they ever found themselves in conflict with them again, then it was probably for the best that they knew how to avoid being killed by the technique. Shorirama weaved a series of seals and then the earthen platform he'd made shifted. Spikes formed all along the body. With his Sharingan, his student's opponent was able to see the attack coming and push off the platform right as the spikes formed and avoid the damage. His retreat was hasty and clumsy, however. He landed right on top of a puddle that formed from one of Shorirama's destroyed clone. A puddle whose existence meant that it was still being maintained by Shorirama's chakra. A quick ram seal later, and Tsukumo was not surprised to see hands rise from the puddle and grab at the genin that had wandered into the lion's den. His student transitioned from the ram seal to the tiger seal and then intoned, water release, starch syrup capturing field, expelling a torrent of sticky syrup from his mouth that landed right onto his opponent as he finally managed to escape the grip of the half-formed water clone. The syrup did its duty, completely immobilizing its target, and the crowd burst into applause as Orochimaru-san declared Tsukumo's most troublesome student as the winner after verifying that the other boy had no means of escape. XXXXXXXX. Winner Shorirama Senju. I let out the breath I didn't even know that I'd been holding and allowed myself to collapse on my ass. Maintaining the water clone technique in its inactive form, the earth rampart jutsu, and the lightning release techniques had taken so much chakra that I'd begun to wonder how I would have continued the fight. The sticky syrup jutsu had left me at the very edge of being tapped out, so if he'd somehow managed to escape that, it would have been it for me. I pushed down with hands and brought myself to my feet. I bit back the scream of pain from stretching the burnt skin out by moving it. I would not allow myself to be taken in with a stretcher, of all things. Power lies where men think it lies, and I could already see the lecture from Tobirama if I committed such a ridiculous affront to the appearance of Senju dominance. Illusion might have been a more appropriate term, but that was beside the point. Chakra exhaustion was making me ramble, I decided. There was no other way to explain my brain's sudden decision to leave reasonable topics and move to the decline of the Senju clan as I knew it. Looking towards the section of the clan reserved for my clansmen told a whole story. Not one I wanted to think about now, however. On my feet finally, I lifted a single hand with a clenched fist to the heavens, and the crowd went wild. Of course, it did. This was easily the battle with the most displayed ninja magic. I probably showed off more ninjutsu than every other person combined in this one round. And then there was Izuku, who had been a terrific dance partner. I looked over at him to see him still stuck in the syrup. The water making up the jutsu would evaporate on its own in barely a minute or so, but there was no need to force him to stay there for so long. I pulled at my chakra. It came to me, if a bit sluggishly, and I formed a ram seal to help my focus. Such a thing should have been seamless and easy for me, but in my present state, I couldn't risk it. Boiling the prison instead of deactivating it was always a possibility. Chakra exhaustion could cause strange things, I'd learned. The syrup lost its adhesive properties and fell all around him. He walked out of the prison and then jumped up to meet me in seconds. I stared at him. He stared back. The crowd was silent all around us. And then he walked even closer to me. There was a collective hush. And then he stretched out a fist towards me. I smiled. He smiled back. I bumped my fist against his. And then the crowd exploded. Need help walking out of here? Please. Well, you've gone and done it this time, Tsunade said. I just looked up at her, unimpressed. Burns along most of your body, and severe chakra depletion, just on the edge of chakra exhaustion. This is beyond the scope of most medical nin to treat and get you ready to go back to the field in time for your next fight, she continued. But not you, right? Who do you think you're talking to, brat? I could fix you in seconds. Brat, you're only 8 years older than me. 8 years is plenty of time, brat. Okay, old woman, do you want me to treat you or not? Like I have a choice in the matter. I could always walk away and leave you here in a mess of your own creation. I've not been assigned to cover these exams as a medic. I could always leave you to the standard fare. Granduncle would kill you, I replied, still unimpressed with her posturing. Would he? He doesn't even know that I'm here. I came out of the goodness of my big heart to help my little baby cousin, and here you are being a massive brat. Bullshit. He sent you. Nothing else would have made you get off that ass of yours. Now come help me before I miss the next fight entirely. Say please. I could still leave, whether he sent me or not. The worst he could do is scold me. We both know you're not stupid enough to believe that. But please, I said, finally capitulating. Good, she said and walked over to my bed with glowing hands. I sighed as she placed her hands on my body, numbing the itching wounds with cool medical chakra. Tsunade was a prodigy, the kind of genius that only came around once in a century. When it came to medical ninjutsu, she was unmatched. Everyone knew it. Even from when she'd been my age, she had already been one of the best in Konoha. Now, she was the best in the world. The fire daimyo paid Konoha millions of ryo for her to check up on him once a year. Tobirama leased out her services for even more money to nobles from other countries. Famously, the lightning daimyo had paid the equivalent of a dozen S-ranked missions for her to help his sick wife. She was a national treasure in more ways than one. I was important to Konoha because of my last name. She'd become so influential on her own that her last name was an afterthought. Tsunade. Not Tsunade Senju. That kind of skill showed in the way she addressed my injuries. True to her word, my burns only lasted a few seconds under her gaze. Of course, she could heal me better than she could with anyone else. Our chakra systems were shockingly compatible. Grandmother Mito said we were more like siblings than cousins based on our chakra alone. Your burns are easy, but the chakra depletion is another thing entirely. There are two ways we can approach this. You can either let me sedate you and then put you in a short recovery coma to accelerate the rate of recovery, or we could do it the slow way. No mystery as to which option she preferred. What's the slow way? I asked her. I give you a jump start with some of my chakra, and you let your genes handle the rest. My calculations say you should be at about 2/3 of your full capacity by the time your second round fight comes about, assuming all the fights take just as long as they did in this round, she said. And why is the coma preferable? Because it gets you back to full. And I don't have to listen to your annoying voice anymore. What's the drawback? Too many questions, brat. You doing it or not? I stared at. She matched my gaze, not giving an inch. I sighed. I strongly dislike you. You love me, and you're lucky you do because I'm the best cousin in the world, she said and then placed her hand on my head. Count to 10, she said. 1, 2, 3. When I woke up, it was to an entirely different medical wing than the one I'd fallen asleep in. Okay, that was a bit of an exaggeration. It wasn't wholly different, just a lot more crowded. Omoikane, the Iowa girl, and I had been the only ones here when I'd gone to sleep, and now there were 2 more occupied beds. Toshiro and Uraum. They'd fought each other. My brain supplied as I noted the marks on Toshiro's skin that oft appeared when one had their chakra networks forcibly closed. The fact that the marks were so visible to me, even from this distance, told me that the fight had been a very tense one for both parties. Uraum needed to have been fighting at her full power and putting everything into each thrust to get chakra scars like that. Ooh, Shori. You're awake? Toshiro asked from his position on the bed. I noted that he was being treated by one of the nurses who had been tending to me before Tsunade appeared and basically told everyone else to fuck off. No, I replied sarcastically, lifting my eyebrow at him. I always wondered what purpose questions like that were intended to achieve. If I wasn't awake, then I wouldn't answer. If I was awake, then should it not have already been obvious? How are you feeling? He asked, letting my sarcasm roll off his back without a reaction. Perfect, I said, pushing myself off the bed. I'm guessing my fight hasn't started yet. Surely, someone would have woken me up if that were the case. It hasn't. Uzume should still be facing off against that Kitsuchi guy from Iowa. Their fight was immediately after mine, and I strongly doubt that that fight would have ended without one of them being sent this way. I nodded at his answer. His logic made perfect sense. I knew Uzume well, and she was one hell of a fighter. Resilient as fuck as well. She wouldn't go down without being brought to serious harm. I also doubted that the Tsuchikage's son would be anything but equally stubborn as she was. Toshiro was right. A fight between them wouldn't end without serious blood. So what happened to the both of you? I asked them, noting that Uraum had not once looked in my direction since I'd woken up. I took some hits, but I won, he said. I nodded. Uraum remained silent. Uraum, I called out to her. Leave me alone, cousin, she said, and I nodded. If that was how she wanted to handle things, then so be it. I stood from my bed and began to walk out of the medical bay. I wanted to see as much of Kitsuchi and Uzume's fight as possible. The man would be a powerful Junin in time, and Uzume was the closest thing I had to a rival in my generation, so I knew very clearly where my strength lay when compared to her. Now I just needed to find out where Kitsuchi fell in that ranking. It took me a few minutes to walk from the bay to the competitor's box and its front row view of the fight unfolding beneath us. Within it, there were only 2 people. Kizaru, who looked overjoyed at my presence, and the silently brooding redhead of Iwagaker's team. I guess that meant he was the one who won that fight. So where was the Kumo contingent? None of them had been at the med bay. Strange for the loser of a battle between Jinchuriki to be well enough not to need medical treatment. I smiled at Kizaru, ensuring to return his enthusiastic greeting before walking straight to my seat to begin watching the fight. As I'd seen coming, the battlefield was a mess. The kind of mess that would make you compare a place to an active war zone. Uzume, standing on one of the few trees that remained standing in the forested section, weaved two seals and took a deep breath. I saw the jutsu coming. Her opponent, standing in front of her, slammed his palms on the ground, forming a dome of tough stone around him. The flame dragon bullet hit the earth dome and failed to break it. I looked at Uzume. Really looked at her. She was exhausted. She was breathing heavily. It was clear that this fight had been going on for a while, and it hadn't been easy on her. She leaned down to pick up her uchiwa, and she held it in a tight grip as she waited for her opponent to show himself. It explained her position on the trees. The fact that she wasn't attacking the dome showed that she didn't believe he was still inside. And looking around, I could spot a myriad of openings in the ground. Kitsuchi was a practitioner of the subterranean voyage technique, it seemed. A skilled one if he'd forced Uzume into a tactic like this. There was a heartbeat of silence. And then the dome exploded outwards, a volley of loose stones flying in every which direction. Unlike we'd expected, Kitsuchi was within the dome itself, and now he was out. Uzume jumped from her position, angling her body to ensure every single rock missed her by some margin. She even managed to look graceful as she did it. Her red eyes gleamed. Fucking Sharingan cheats. Kitsuchi was careful not to meet them as he geared to square up with her in close combat. His fists, wreathed in stone, were lifted to either side of his head as he took a stance not unlike what a boxer from my old world would have. Uzume had no such stance. She came with pure fury. Her first swing was blocked by said stone gauntlet, and he tried to use the opportunity to land a powerful punch on her, but her body collapsed into a swarm of sakura flowers. She appeared a few meters away on his other side and prepared to land the attack on his unguarded side. Displaying agility that belied his frame, he leaned out of the way of the uchiwa and punched right at the fan. It was too durable for him to break like that, but his force was enough to tear it out of her grip. Without her weapon, the Iwa genin seemed to have decided she was less of a threat and quickly moved in to press his perceived advantage. What a fool. The uchiwa was a relatively new addition to her arsenal. She'd used it for less than a year, after all. She was more dangerous without it in her hands than she was with it. I saw it then. She snapped her fingers. Kitsuchi, for some reason, punched out in precisely the opposite direction from her. Genjutsu. Sound-based. Interesting. So she'd found some way to either copy Kizuru's technique or create her own facsimile of the technique. Either way, she'd done it. She slammed her fist against the ground and lifted it up with a very familiar stone gauntlet on it. Kitsuchi continued to chase his illusionary opponent, and she limped towards his position, struggling with the earth in addition to her form. When she was close enough and Kitsuchi's battle placed him in a convenient position for her, she swung. The sound echoed across the quiet stadium, a thud. Kitsuchi presented no resistance, falling to the floor unconscious almost instantly. And then it came. The crowd was electrified, louder than I'd ever heard them. Winner. Uzume Uchiha, Orochimaru's voice was drowned out. Medical staff flooded the battlefield, seeking out both of the participants. Uzume had fallen on her ass the moment she'd knocked her opponent out. She was sitting upright now, and thanks to the big screen, I could see her face clearly. She looked pissed. Very pissed. Shorirama Senju and Roshi of Iowa, please make their way down to the field. The winner of this battle will face Kizuru Kurama after a brief break. Jiraiya's voice on the megaphone cut through the crowd's voices. FTER reading this, you can either wait till next week for the next chapter or read the next two on Patreon right now and keep reading as I write. For the Patreon, you can remove the hyphen between Pa and Trian and Google it, then search for my username Oganevogaga. Or you could copy the link in my bio and remove the spaces before pasting in your address bar. Have fun with this also. In case you haven't checked out my other story, Gamer of the Desert, yet, then please do so. It's also set in the Naruto universe. It's an SI into Gaara with some gamer elements. I can guarantee you'll love it. It's also much farther along than this one, so gives you something to really sink your teeth into. I was on the back foot from the beginning. If I'd been foolish enough to get the thought in my head that this would have been an easy night after watching my opponent limp out into the field, then he would have thoroughly disabused me of that notion in seconds. I jumped out of the way of another volley of lava release projectiles. I'd make sure to get at Uzume for her stunning inability to convey scale when she gave reports later on. He did not pause between jutsu, it was like he was attempting to flood the arena with lava. In the first exchange, I'd decided to try to go jutsu for jutsu with him, countering each lava ball with a water jutsu of my own. I wasn't so stupid anymore. I jumped out of the way of another attack, banking in my run. And then, I came face to face with a volley of about 7 different lava balls. I formed a single seal. Water release. Water severing wave. I formed a thin blade of water between my lips and moved my head across, slicing through all of them and then dropped to the floor, placing my hands on the ground to form a wall that managed to block one attack before melting against the second. I pushed off, banking to the right sharply. He was quickly turning this into a ninjutsu battle, and unlike him, I didn't have the chakra equivalent of a nuclear reactor sitting in my gut to keep me going. I strongly doubted Tsunade would be kind enough to top me off after this one ended. Even worse, I still had another fight waiting for me after I managed to beat this guy, if I managed to beat him. He flipped seals for the first time, and I breathed a sigh of relief to see that it was a tiger seal. Finally, no more lava release. Monkey flame arson, he said, taking a deep breath. The older teenager bent forward and breathed out what I would be underselling to call a firestorm of green flames. It was so much fire, so much bloody fire. The closest in-universe example I could think of was Madara's Great Fire Annihilation, and all of it was coming right at me. I formed 2 seals, forcing as much chakra into my stomach as possible. I needed it once, twice, thrice, forcing the chakra to bend in on itself as I created water release chakra and then used that to create even more water release chakra. And then I funneled all of it down into the ground beneath me. Water release chakra did as it ought, it made water. And then it looked for water, multiplying everything until there was so much water beneath me that I barely needed to force the next step. This was a jutsu I'd been saving to use against Uzume, and I was going to have to pull it out here, still miles away from the finals. Water release. Exploding water colliding wave, I screamed as I slammed my fist into the ground. All around me, water burst from the ground, rushing onwards to meet the slow-moving firestorm. The water came in waves, moving first in a smaller wave and then widening as it got farther and farther from me. In the beginning, the fire evaporated the water, creating harsh steam, but more and more water closed in on what fire remained. What a show! Jiraiya's voice cut through the silence as I stared through the steam, looking for my opponent. Senju, I heard suddenly and whipped around to see him standing on the water that had formed a solid 1-foot-deep layer across the entire arena. It was evaporating rapidly, as I wasn't using my chakra to slow down the process. I doubted I had the reserves to pull that off, even if I wanted to. You are strong. Stronger than they said. Goodbye. You fought well, he said, and then closed his eyes. Oh fuck no. Any other opponent and I'd be confused. This one, I was just scared. I unseal my bow and quiver faster than I ever had. I loaded a single arrow and shot it, applying wind release to make sure it shot straight through his head with no resistance. It flew faster and surer than I could have run the distance. But it was still too slow. He reached up and caught the arrow in his grip. His eyes were red, and they were glowing. The transformation began with the hand that had caught my arrow. Bubbling red chakra surrounded it. And then that chakra began to spread until it surrounded his whole body. Something told me that I should be doing something. Making some movement, some jutsu, shooting an arrow, maybe. But I stood transfixed at the sight. It was so fascinating. The chakra actively boiled the water at his feet as it got that far. And then, after surrounding his body, it amassed at his tailbone and then branched out to form a tail. A tail that waved in the air behind him. All that red chakra then began to heat up. I could feel the heat from here even. Lava. It turned into lava. It was instant. Almost like I'd blinked. Where the first transformation had been slow and methodical, this one had been instantaneous. It also came with an instant burst in speed. He covered the distance between us almost too quickly for me to keep up with. I only dodged by commanding the water at my feet to carry me backwards. He punched the ground where I'd stood, forming an instant crater. Oh fuck me, I lamented to myself. I knocked another arrow and fired it right at him. The water release chakra was able to last better against his armor instead of burning up at first contact, but it still meant nothing as he deflected the attack with a savage backhand that showed more rage than one would expect. I don't think I've done very much to piss him off, I thought to myself. Only to facepalm as I figured that it was probably a result of the tailed beast's chakra running through his body. Tailed beast chakra. That was right. This armor only worked because he was powering it with the Yonbi's chakra. Otherwise, I doubted he had the reserves and control to pull off something like this on his own. But did that matter? Was it anything more than an academic discovery? It wasn't like there was anything I could do about it now that I knew it was tailed beast chakra. Maybe if there was some sort of rule against that, then I would be able to cry foul to the ref and get things settled in my favor. I looked in his direction, seeing him watching everything with an amused smile on his face. Yeah, there was no chance Orochimaru was stepping in. I body flickered all the way to the other side of the arena to avoid the stomp that shattered the ground I'd been standing on. And then I scowled, noting that I'd dropped my bow in my haste. Moving, I focused my chakra in my arm and began to command it to take shape as I needed. He ran towards me again, not giving me time to breathe. Working on a jutsu, I didn't have the opportunity to body flicker away. I ducked under the first swipe that threatened to turn my head and neck into distant acquaintances, and stepped back from a stomp that tried to grab hold of one of my feet. My footwork was immaculate as I danced around the pissed-off Jinchuriki. He was faster than I in a straight line. He could cover distances faster than I could truly think. But none of that mattered in close combat. Not against me, at least. He moved quicker than I did, but it didn't matter because every move he made was hideously telegraphed. I stepped to the side of a thrust aimed at my chest, and knowing my jutsu was ready, I completed a thrust of my own. Unprepared and caught with his pants down, Roshi of Iwa took a full-powered Rasengan right in the head. I pushed down with the jutsu from the second I made contact, forcing it to grind further and further into the Iwa Genin's armor before the jutsu finally exploded and sent him flying backwards. Breathing room. Finally, I took stock of my body, noting the burns on my left hand and the ones across all my exposed skin from being in such close proximity to the lava armor. The former was much more severe than the latter, but the latter were still something to worry about. I looked at the hand, figuring that I hadn't damaged any of the important tenketsu and that the damage was most likely superficial. The only problem was that this was going to make it a bitch and a half to weave hand seals. Luckily, the next jutsu did not require any of them. First things first, rotation. I forced the chakra to spin all around my arm. I added the power next. And then came containment. The Rasengan formed in no time, a ball of spinning threads of chakra. An impressive jutsu all on its own. And then I turned the containment up a notch to force the ball to change shape. I hadn't managed to figure out a way to form this type of Rasenshuriken any quicker than this. But luckily, my opponent seemed satisfied thinking about his life from his half-buried position into the stadium wall. He only really seemed to zone back in by the time I'd completed my jutsu. I held it above my head, waiting for him to move from the wall so I could throw it without risking the integrity of the entire structure. He acquiesced to my unspoken request, pushing himself off the wall with a slow movement. It was then that I noticed that he clearly hadn't just been laying there doing nothing. Where one tail had once floated behind him, now there were two. Two tails of dense lava. There was no change to the armor itself, I thought. A thought that fled my head when every instinct I had told me to dodge. I did it, moving out of the way of an attack I hadn't seen coming at all. He stood where I'd stood, tilting his head at me, and so I did the only thing I could think of. I thrust the Rasenshuriken in my hand into his chest at an angle that I knew would send him flying upwards, not towards the civilians. This time, I was more than content to allow the jutsu fly without me right from the get-go. The spinning blades ground into his armor as they pushed him further and further into the air. Even as I watched it, I could tell it wouldn't be enough. Maybe if I could have pulled off a wind release Rasenshuriken, then I might have some chance of putting him down with that blow alone, but I knew the limits of my jutsu. Kukuku, I turned to the third member of my cousin's team and saw him watching Roshi's floating form with a slimy smile on his face. Creepy bastard. I'd found him creepy from the moment I was introduced to his character in the anime. Thinking about that brought another memory to my head. He'd subdued a rampaging Jinchuriki. How? I tried to remember as much as I could. It had something to do with odd and even numbers. Naruto had the 8 trigrams seal. Orochimaru had sealed his seal with something odd numbered. What was it? The 5 symbols seal. No, not that. 5 elements. Gyogo Fuin. I could try that here. Only problem, I didn't know Gyogo Fuin. In fact, I knew precious few seals that would have any effect here. If only I'd been born with the adamantium sealing chains like a good Uzumaki. Life would be so much easier. No use crying over spilt milk. The jutsu ran its course and allowed its victim to drop to the ground. Looking into the crater he'd formed, I saw that he was already healing the wound that went most of the way through his stomach. Any other person would be either dead or dying. He just had to take a few seconds to breathe. I turned to Orochimaru, hoping he would call the match in my favor either way, but the man seemed satisfied with avoiding my gaze. Fuck him. I jumped into the crater, kunai in my hand. I could already feel my chakra reserves and how they dropped to dangerous levels. Using exploding water colliding wave on such short notice had taken more than its usual due. A usually draining technique became punishing without the efficiency gains from slow use. Adding a Rasengan and then a Rasenshuriken to that was just begging for punishment. His eyes were closed. His armor was gone. I just had to do this quickly and end it. I squatted near his position and reared my kunai up. I closed my eyes at the thought of what I was about to do. But Roshi would grow into a powerful Jinchuriki that would threaten my life in future. This wasn't murder. It was self-defense. I brought the blade down. 1 foot, 2 feet, and then it stopped. I felt a powerful grip on my wrist. I looked down to see the Iwa Jinchuriki staring at me with red eyes. No. Fuck. He began to squeeze. I could feel my wrist straining. The bones weren't made to take this kind of pressure. With his hand around my wrist, he climbed to his feet, taking me along for the ride. He lifted me up like I was some sort of trophy. Fuck him. I stabbed my right hand right at his chest, wielding my chakra as a lance and tearing through his heart. He just tilted his head at me, as if the attack hadn't even registered. Red chakra poured from him in waves. My wrist was burning. It was like I'd dipped it in acid, but even worse because the pain wasn't reducing as my nerves fried themselves. Fuck. The chakra around him crescendoed until it formed 3 floating tails behind him. Fucking Jinchuriki. There are some seals I teach you only for you to have the knowledge. You are never to use them on anyone. Pay close attention, Shorikun. This is what our ancestors called the 3-body disruption seal. 3-body disruption. Exactly what I said. It works to divorce the relationship between a target's mind, body, and soul. That memory played over and over again in my mind. It was like the universe was sending me a message. I had to use it against him. I had to. The only problem was that I'd never been taught how to actually apply it on a target. Grandmother had taught me about the seal, and its effects, and even shown me the matrix, but I'd never practiced it before. I had no idea if I could even use it. Especially without a matrix. I'd be applying a new seal with touch. Everything I'd been taught told me it was impossible, but how true was that really? I was a genius without peer. I'd learned seals so quickly even an Uzumaki seal mistress was impressed. I could do this. I had to. I formed the matrix in my mind, making sure I had a clear picture of everything even as my body burned from within. I made sure I had it, and then I took the chance to plant my hand on his chest. He laughed. He was playing with me. I ignored the burning from both sides of my body. My wrist and my right palm. I zoned it out. I smashed the image of the seal into my chakra and slammed it against his chest with my hand. I watched the kanji spread across his body with a grimace on my face. The pain was too much for me to even remain conscious anymore. As I lost touch with reality, all I heard was a single deep voice saying, "That was a mistake." Tsukumo knew that something was wrong the moment that his student placed the seal on the Iwa boy. Perhaps it was simply a bad feeling, but one did not survive as a shinobi by ignoring bad feelings. That was why he was already moving before disaster truly struck. When the red chakra surrounding Roshi of Iwa was cut off, he hesitated. That hesitation almost cost Hashirama his life. The other boy stumbled backwards, dropping his student from his grip, and fell to his knees. Some sort of pain-causing seal? Tsukumo asked himself as the boy curled in on himself holding his stomach. But that turned not to be the case. The boy's skin turned red, and in less than a few seconds, he had jumped into the arena, grabbed his student and jumped out. He noted Tsunade Senju also on her way into the arena as he left, but she aborted the movement once she noticed him. His actions proved to not be a second too hasty, as right behind him swelled a body. He could feel the malicious chakra behind him but dared not turn around. He carried cargo more precious than most things in Konoha. The heir to the Senju clan. Speaking off, he moved to the other Senju he was familiar with and dropped her cousin in her hands. If there was anywhere for Hashirama to be, then the custody of the greatest medical ninja in Konoha who also happened to be his cousin was the undoubted best choice. No longer burdened by his unconscious student, he returned his attention to the arena. He'd heard the roars and the screams earlier, so he'd thought he would have been prepared for what he saw, but the sight of a massive monkey with 4 tails and bright red fur was not one that he was ready for. Especially not when he could feel the being's malicious chakra pressing down on him. He warded it off well, shrouding himself with his own chakra, but he had to spread that shroud further to cover the Chunin near him that had almost collapsed to the floor from the force. "Thank you, Hitaki-san," one of them said. He nodded. He knew that man. He had been one of those who had claimed that Tsukumo was too young to have been promoted to Junin back when he was. Oh, how things changed. He maintained his stare at the beast. Tsunade was busy healing her cousin. He could already tell that she would be occupied there for a while. The boy's wounds had not been pretty to see, and there had been something very wrong in his chakra network. Tsukumo could not diagnose what it was, but he could tell a problem when he saw one. He noted Orochimaru from the corner of his eyes, making a very hasty retreat from the field, not gathering any of the beast's attention. Jiraiya stood at the edge of the commentator's box. If Tsukumo did not know better, he would have thought that he had some plan that involved jumping down and facing the creature. Tsukumo took his attention to the cage box next. The Raikage had left in a huff after his Jinchuriki had lost today, and both the Mizu and Kei's cages had not bothered staying for the final round with all their shinobi eliminated. That meant that there were only 2 cage in the box, and if this wasn't an accident, then the Hokage could be in danger from the Tsuchikage. He spotted the Tsuchikage's small form fly out of the cage box as the Hokage jumped down to the ground in front of the tailed beast. Tsukumo took a deep breath and prepared to jump down as well. He would not let his cage fight alone. "Don't," he heard. It was Tsunade's voice. "What? My granduncle has it more than handled. If you jump into a fight like that, you'd just be getting in the way," she said. "No Konoha shinobi worth anything can watch his cage fight alone and not step in," he replied. "Well, this is an exemption to the rule. Just stand and watch." He nodded at her. She would know better than he. It was her grandfather who had captured all the tailed beasts in the first place. And wasn't that just one hell of a feat? Now that he'd felt the chakra of the 4 tails, he was beginning to reconsider all that he'd thought about the first Hokage. He'd thought at least some of the famed power he was said to have must have been exaggerated, but to be able to capture 9 such creatures as this one, and to then be capable of giving those creatures out like sweets at a store showed a level of power that went beyond Tsukumo's imagination. And now he watched that same man's brother prepare to do battle. Tobirama Senju, the second Hokage of Konoha, shared some similarities with his grandnephew, Hashirama. One of them was their affinity for water release, but when Tobirama brought his own water release to bear, he made it clear that the difference between a grown Senju and a child was night and day. He formed a single hand seal. One seal. He didn't even announce the name of the jutsu out loud, but Tsukumo knew it was the same jutsu that his student had used earlier. Instead of enough water to overwhelm a firestorm, the Hokage made a tsunami. A tsunami. With no water supply, just how own chakra. And all this with a single hand seal. He maintained the seal as the massive wave of water bore down on the tailed beast. XXXXX Chunin Hideo Umino. He stared at the devastation around him with wide eyes. There was so much death. More death than he'd ever seen in one place before. He'd been too young to fight in the last war, and part of him was beginning to wonder if this is what war really like. His elders always said that war was nothing like what the stories made it out to be, but he shuddered at thinking that it could have been this terrible. Surely, if it was this bad, then wars would never happen. After the first one, everyone would have seen the damage and decided not to do it again. Wars couldn't be as bad as this, he concluded, and then moved on to perform his duties. He and a team of dozens of chunin had been placed in charge of three things: counting the dead, gathering the bodies, and taking them to the hospital for families to claim them at the morgue. It was an efficient system, he thought. And then hated himself for the thought. These weren't just cargo to be sealed up and moved. They were people too. He turned and saw Yukitake on the floor. He was vomiting again. He'd vomited twice already. Thrice now. Surely, if he didn't have the stomach for this, he would have applied to be sent elsewhere. There was no shortage of work to be done in the village. He was one of the few who had been at the stadium and watching the entire thing happen with wide eyes. After the Aiwa monster had defeated Shorirama Senju, it had decided to transform into a massive beast. A tailed beast. The four-tailed sage monkey, he'd heard it called by the older Junin. Such a creature in the center of Konoha had caused damage beyond anyone's imagination. If he hadn't been lucky enough to stand next to powerful Junin like Hatake Sakumo and Senju Tsunade, then he doubted that he'd have made it out alive. But he also recognized that the fact that the beast hadn't managed to leave the arena was a testament to the power of Hokage-sama. He had used water release like Hideo had never seen in his life to put down the beast. Not fast enough, however. The beast had created multiple volcanoes in the middle of the field, sending lava everywhere. He still remembered one massive glob of the corrosive liquid dropping at him right from the sky. And then Hatake was there. A single handseal and the lava was gone. Hideo still had no idea how he'd done it or even what it was that he had done exactly. In all fairness, busy worrying about his life, he had more important things on his mind. At the end of the day, that was the part of the stadium that sustained the least damage. Some other Junin protected some other areas, but not all of them. They couldn't reach everywhere. Not even close. But work was already beginning. In the areas his squad had cleared, another squad used earth ninjutsu in concert to rebuild the stadium. Whispers in the wind said Hokage-sama would be continuing the tournament since all the foreigners had been eliminated, but he doubted it. This was just too much damage. You couldn't move on from that. How many have you got, Yumino-san? He turned to his Junin captain and smiled. She was so beautiful. A Hyuga. Everything about her was perfect. From the long hair that went down to her wide hips to the eyes. Those pupil-less eyes that seemed to stare through him. It felt like she was the only one who saw him as he was. Not as how she hoped he would be. Ahem. He heard her cough. He also heard the others laughing, bastards. A glare at Nara and Sarutobi did nothing to stop their horsing around. 57. Hyuga-san, he told her. Hamiko-chan, he really wanted to call her. That means the total number comes in at 1,390, she said. Everyone stopped laughing at that. Over 1,000 people dead. That was a disaster.